belief systems beyond the colonial period. So, again, on behalf of the University of the Philippines, Baguio, which is the convener of the 10th session for the conference, I welcome you all to our panel for today. Here's a little bit of an introduction for those of you who weren't here yesterday. On the eve of the arrival of Christianity in the Philippines 500 years ago, we were communities that had religious belief systems along with Muslim principalities. Our session revisits the impact and ramifications of the Christian social order on the Filipinos for the whole stretch of 500 years. Panel 2 takes off from yesterday's informative and thought-provoking discussions. So we have 4 people lined up today, and that's why I'm jumping into the introduction right away. So what we're going to do is give you an idea of the lineup, and then I will be introducing the speakers right before they're about to present, right? So here's our lineup for today's speakers. Our first speaker will be Dr. Jose Romel D. Hernandez of De La Salle University in Manila. And his presentation is entitled Ang Diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol at ang Pagbubuo ng Nakaraang Pilipino. Our second speaker for today, Dr. Deirdre de la Cruz of the Department of History and Asian Languages and Cultures of the University of Michigan in the United States, will be presenting a paper called Other Christianities, the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas in the early 20th century. Now our third speaker, Father Michael Layugan, SVP, from the Divine Word Seminary in Tagaytay City, which is also in the Philippines, is going to discuss the third wave of evangelization of the Philippines. And finally, Dr. Christopher Rezos Esquejo of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, is going to discuss a paper entitled Empathy, Shame, and Death of Gratitude, the campaign of Filipino Baptists towards autonomy and self-empowerment from 1922 to 1935. All very exciting topics we have here, especially if you're interested in the religious history of the Philippines. So let me just repeat a couple of reminders that I mentioned at the beginning of the session, and then we can begin with our first speaker. So for those of you who are currently in our Zoom room, everyone is encouraged to ask questions to our speakers, especially because they have such great topics. To do this, you may use the Zoom chat or the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screens for this purpose. You may also use the chat to post your comments and insights, so they don't necessarily have to be just questions. We love to get a good conversation flowing between our speakers and our attendees. Third, please maintain proper decorum and respect throughout the session. Any attendees who breach our guidelines will unfortunately be removed from the Zoom room and barred from re-entry. I hope you understand. We want to keep this a academic setting. Finally, please refrain from posting information such as your institutional affiliation unless prompted to do so. Thank you very much. All right, so jumping into it. Our first speaker is hold on. Our first speaker, Dr. Romel D. Hernandez. Let's give him a short introduction. He is currently assistant professor and president of the Department of History at De La Salle University, Manila. He used to be, sorry, my script here jumped a little bit. He is currently, or he used to be, the convener of the graduate program of the said department. He finished his MA and PhD at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and he has taught at different colleges and universities, such as the University of Santo Tomas and the University of the Philippines at Diliman. His research interests include colonial Spain, or the period of colonial Spain, particularly changes in belief systems and religion. So he has also translated several documents documents from the Philippine entities done work in areas of the Philippine Revolution and has done ethnographies and other articles related to religion, nationalism, and the formation of Filipino nationalist consciousness. So once again, let's welcome Dr. Jose Ramel P. Hernandez to present his talk. Thank you very much, sir. You can begin. Sir Hernandez, are you here with us? Hold on, let's see if we're having just a bit of technical difficulty here. Just give us a couple of moments. We're sorry to the people who are currently here. We just need to get Dr. Hernandez back on board. Just wait a couple of moments.
Maybe we can give him just a minute. He was already in the Zoom room.
Yes. By the way, for those of you who are watching us today, the voice right there was Dr. Marianela Torrendo, who is the department head at the University of the Philippines, Baguio's Department of History and Philosophy. So, ayun po.
Yeah. Their Dr. Hernandez is in already.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Hernandez. Are you ready to begin your presentation po? Maybe you need a couple of seconds muna here. Isn't it great how being online helps us all connect to each other no matter where we are in the world? But you know, there are these moments where we adjust to internet connectivities where they might not be so great. So let's see. Hello po, Dr. Hernandez. Are you able to hear me po?
Yeah.
Yes, that's great.
Sorry.
Yeah, no worries po.
Medyo medyo ng problem ako ng ating activity. Sorry for that. Good morning to everyone.
I'm sorry, sir. Mukhang nag-cut off po ulit yata yung audio nyo.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Good. You're back, yes.
Okay. So, yeah, that's right. Sorry for that.
No worries po.
Morning po sa inyo lahat.
Yeah, we can see you, sir. You can begin your presentation po.
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, I would like to apologize for the inconveniences. No? Medyo na problema yung aking connectivity. So, if I would share my screen.
I'll let you know po, sir, when we can see your screen po. For now, what we see is your camera po.
Okay. Wala pa rin.
Wala pa po, sir. It's okay, we can wait naman po.
Sorry.
No worries. So while we're waiting for the presentation to begin, no, I just want to say hello to our participants. I love seeing when you guys say hi in the chat. It gives us the sense of being in the same room, you know. So everyone from Bulacan, Baguio City, Leyte, Aklan. Wow, what a great group of people we have in the audience. And even someone from New Jersey. Wala pa po, sir. Perhaps you would like to try again po?
Hold on, ha? Sorry.
Sige lang po. Okay.
Ayan. Ano naman?
I'll tell you po, sir, pag nakikita na po namin.
Okay. Ayan, lumabas ba? Or hindi pa?
Ayun, sir. Yes, there we go. We can see it has started screen sharing, so it should be ready with it. Ayan. Thank you, sir.
Ayan. So, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Ito po ang magiging titulo ng aking presentasyon. Sa umagang ito, ang diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol at ang pagbubuo ng nakaraang Pilipino. Naayos lang po natin at mukhang mas mabilis yung ating mga isip kaysa sa isip ng aking computer. So, bali po, ang aking magiging presentasyon ay magkakaroon ng tatlong bahagi. Narito po, no? Umaayos na naman, medyo problema. Okay, so yan. Ito po ang aking titulo, no? At of course ay susunod yung aking magkakaroon po ito ng tatlong bahagi. Ang una po ay yung pagkilala sa mga yugto ng pagkakabuo ng kaisipang Espanyol at ng estado nito, pagsapit ng panahon ng pagtatatag ng imperyo. Ikalawa, pagkilala ng kaisipang pangreliyoso sa Pilipinas bago pa man dumating ang kolonisasyon. At ikatlo, ang pag-uugnay ng dalawang naunang kaisipan upang makabuo ng isang pananampalataya. So sabihin, sa simula ay sa unang dalawa ay magkakaroon tayo ng pagtingin, no? Mula doon sa pananaw ng mga Espanyol kung ano sila, kung ano yung kanilang kamalayan, yung kanilang kalinangan bago sila ating bansa, sa ating mga isla, sa ating isang kapuluan. At pagkatapos, yung ikalawa ay yung namang sa sa Pilipinas at yung pag-uugnay ng dalawa sa makatuwid, yung ating titingnan is of course nasa loob ng parametro ng kalinangan at ng kamalayan ng mga tao. No? So, hindi po tayo papasok doon sa ilang o sa mga detalye, kundi ang mahalaga na pagtuunan ng pansin o kaisipan na makikita natin or mahihinukan doon sa mga pangyayari. Okay? Sa larangan po o sa kaisipan po ng mga Espanyol ay mayroong at least tatlong yugto na makikita natin sa kanilang kasaysayan na bubuo ng kanilang kaisipan. No? Una ay yung tinatayang pagdating ng apostol na si Santiago, kasunod ng mga tinatawag na 7 Varones Apostolicos at iba pang mga tinatawag nga nilang mga varones nung unang kalahati ng unang siglo. So ibig sabihin, yung Kristyanisasyon, no, ng mga Espanyol, no, o yung mga nandoon sa Iberian Peninsula ay nagsimula na sa panahong ito. Kaya napakalaki ng kanilang debosyon doon sa kay Santiago. No? At of course, itong panahon na ito na pagbuhubog sa kanila ng Kristyanismo ay mananatili hanggang taong 313. At iyon, yung panahon kung kung saan na magkakaroon na ng tinatawag na edikto ng Milan, kung saan yung si Emperador o si Constantino ay papayagan na nila na patuloy na aalisin na nila yung order para sa ng mga Kristiyano. No? At pagkatapos, ito ay magpapatuloy hanggang panahon ng Konseho ng Nicaea sa taong 325 sapagkat ito yung lalakas yung panimula na nahubog na kaisipang Kristiyano sa mga nasa Espanya. No? At matatapos yung yugto, no? na ito hanggang sa pagdating ng mga Visigodos o yung mga Visigoths na sinasabi ng 497. And then ikalawa, ang pagdating ng mga Visigodos noong 497 hanggang sa pagdating ng mga Muslim o ng Kalifato na umayad noong sa taong 711. Sa pagdating na ito ay magsisimula na rin yung dahil nga yung napakalaki o napakalakas na nakikita nila na impluensya ng Kristyanismo at pagiging Kristiyano ng mga Espanyol. No? Of course, ay tawag natin na Espanyol. No? Pero sa Hispania, no? Nung dumating yung mga Muslim doon sa kanilang katimugan, ay kaagad na sila ay nagsimula rin ng pakikipaglaban. Yung tinatawag yung pagdating ng mga tao dito ng mga Muslim ay kinikilala nila bilang mga pagdating ng kongkista at yung kanilang pakikipaglaban doon is tinatawag na reconquista. Yung mga Visigodos o yung mga Visigoths, sila ay kinikilala ng mga barbaro ng mga Romano noon. Sa panahon ito, sila ay actually mga Kristiyano na. At of course ay tinanggap na nila yung mga kaayusan na ginawa ng mga Romano maging sa batas, sa kultura, at of course ay Christianize kung kaya't kung meron ng mga binhi na simula pa sa unang century o first century ay actually lumakas pa rin sa panahon na ito. Kaya paman, of course, ay kaya ang lakas-lakas ng kanilang pakikipaglaban sa mga Muslim. At of course, no, yung buo na yon, yung panahon simula 711 ay magtatapos lamang sa panahon ng 1492, sa taon ng 1492 kung saan ng mga Espanyol yung Granada o bumagsak ng Granada sa kamay of course ng nagkakaisang kaharian ng Castilla at Aragon. You would remember na nagkaroon ng pag-aasawa o pag-iisang dibdib sina Fernando at Isabela. So sa pagitan ng 711 na ito, 711 at saka 1492 ay dahil nga patuloy silang lumalaban, ang tawag nila dyan ay reconquista. At yung mentalidad ng reconquista ang siyang dadalhin ng mga Espanyol sa bagong daigdig hanggang sa makarating sila sa Pilipinas. At kung titingnan pa natin mabuti, sa pagdating nila sa Pilipinas, yung malakas doon sa katimugan ay mga Muslim. So ibig sabihin, analogous ang tingin nila sa kanilang ginagawa sa Pilipinas doon sa nangyari sa kanila sa Espanya. So yung reconquista nila para sa mga Muslim, laban sa mga Muslim, ay gagawin din nila bilang reconquista dito sa Pilipinas. So yung conquista ng Pilipinas ay actually pagpapatuloy ng reconquista ng Espanya. Okay? Now, sinasabi natin, magiging napakahalaga ng ikatlong yugto sapagkat ito rin ang pagsisimula ng kaisipang rekonkista. Konkista ang tawag sa pananakop na ginawa ng mga Muslim at rekonkista ang matagal na pagsisikap at pakikipaglaban ng mga karihan upang mabawi ang kabuuan ng Espanya mula sa mga infieles o yung mga Mahometanos, mga Muslim. Magsisimula lamang ang pagtatapos ng paghaharing Muslim sa katimugang Espanya sa pag-iisang dibdib ni Fernando na hari ng Aragon at Isabela na reyna ng Castilla. Ngayon sa Pilipinas, yung nadatnan nila ay yung pananampalataya na anito mismo ay magsisimula pa around mga 3,000 BK o bago sa kasalukuyan, BP, before present. Kasabay ng wika at mga elementong pangkalinangan, mabubuo ang pananampalataya ng anito mismo. Bukod pa ito sa pagdating ng Islam, pagsabot ng huling bahagi ng ika-14 na taon hanggang sa maagang bahagi ng ika-15. Aabot ng Islam sa ilang bahagi ng Luzon, subalit may higit na malalim ang pagkakaugat nito sa Mindanao. So, at pagkatapos, of course, ay bali, ang mga Austronesyano ay kalat sa Pilipinas by 1,000 years. Mabubuo yung wika at kakabit noon ay yung isang konsepto o mga konsepto na magiging sa bahagi ng pagkakabuong pangkalinangan ng isang kapuluan. Una ay yung konsepto ng anito na nakaugnay sa konsepto ng mga tinatawag na mga ninuno. In fact, yung anito is synonymous with nuno or ninuno. At pagkatapos ay of course ay yung kanilang konsepto ng bayan, ng settlement na nakaunaman sa tahanan or yung tinatawag na balay o yung bahay. Okay? So, anito, bayan, bahay. Okay? So, yun yung magkakaugnay-ugnay. Ngayon, of course, dahil nga ay armas yung kanilang nakikita o yung pakikipaglaban sa mga Muslim, ay ganun din yung nakikita nila na gagawin nila sa katimugan ng Pilipinas. So, at iyon ay tawag dito, yung pagpasok na yun ng mga Muslim is of course magiging o makakarating sa gawing Luzon pero very superficial noong pagdating ng mga Kastila. Sapagkat sabi nila, mga Muslim ito pero bakit nagtataka sila na kumakain ng baboy, ng pork. No? So medyo, kumbaga parang lumalabas ay merong superficial na Islamization dito sa Lowi ng Luzon. Okay? Now, ano ngayon yung nakita noong sila ay pinakilala ng mga Espanyol yung sa kanila yung Kristyanismo. Okay? By 1582 ay nagsimula yung atas ng simbahan at ng pamahalaan na sibil para doon sa pagbubuo ng mga etnografiya at yung pagkilala sa kultura ng mga tao na nadatnan nila sa Pilipinas. Okay? So, iyon ay mandate ng Synod of Manila, pinangunahan ni Domingo de Salazar. At of course, ang mga lumabas ay of course mga etnografiya, siyempre, katulad ng kay Plasencia, katulad ng kina Chirino. Kung mapapansin niyo, siyempre, lahat ng mga etnografiya na ito, lahat ng mga descriptions na yan ay post-1582. Sapagkat yung, again, iyon ay panahon na para kilalanin nila yung mga tao na nadatnan nila. No? At of course, sa huli, ganito yung parang naging konklusyon. No? So parang ito ay base doon sa isang claim, no? Of course, mahaba pero ito yung panimula, no? Que el genio de estos indios es un embolismo de contradicciones y contrariedades. Creo no que no es la peor de las descripciones, no? Sabi niya, ang katalinuhan ng mga inyong ito ay isang pagsasama-sama ng mga kontradiksyon at kapalintunahan at naniniwala akong hindi ito ang pinakakasama nilang paglalarawan. So parang nakita na nila yung parang bakit ba ang daming binubuo na kontradiksyon ng mga Pilipino, no? At bakit ba yung kanilang ginagawa ay parang ang hirap-hirap intindihin, no? Sabi ng mga Kastila, no? So ito yung kanilang genius, baga, na contradiction sa isa't isa. Now anyways, kakabit nun, no? Sinasabi pa nila bakit dagli ang tinanggap ng buo ang pananampalatayang Kristiyano, no? So at doon sa pagtanggap na yun na buo, no? Ay parang ang bilis-bilis nila iniwan yung anituismo. Tapos gayon pa man, kung sila man ay naging o tumanggap ng pananampalatayang Kristiyano, hindi naman nila nauunawaan ang lalim ng mga misteryo ng pananampalataya. So halimbawa ay sinasabi na kinakausap ng isang misyonero yung isang Bisaya, sinabi na ikinukwento yung kwento ni Noah ni Noe, yung flood, yung baha. Sabi na ang nakakita talaga ng contradiction yung Indio. Ang sabi ng Indio, bakit tawag dito? Kung sinasabi mo na mahal ng Diyos ang tao, pero bakit siya ay tawag dito, umayag at siya mismo yung gumawa na magpadala ng isang malaking baha para malipo lahat ng mga tao. Okay? Ngayon, sabi ng misyonero, hindi siya kumibo kasi sa huli, hindi naman talaga nauunawaan ng mga taong ito ang lalim ng misteryo ng pananampalataya. So, hindi naman siya sumagot. Pero agad, iyon ang kanyang konklusyon. Okay? At yung sinasabi pa, no, ay ang maghanap ng espesipikong kaligiran ng kasalanan ay tila pumapasok sa hindi malulusotang labirinto. Sabihin, kasi meron sila mga manual for confession. Yung mga manual for confession na yan ay tawag dito, nakalagay doon ay mga questions, mga katanungan, sunod-sunod, no? At sabi nila, at sasagutin mo lang ng yes or no, sí o no, oo o hindi. Ngayon, kapag sabi nila, kapag sinimulan mo na tanungin yung mga Indio base doon sa pagkakasunod-sunod ng mga question, no? Ng mga katanungan, hindi mo mabuo sa isip mo kung ano yung gustong sabihin ng Indio, kung oo o hindi, at nagkakaroon ng contradiction sa bawat question. So, the thing kasi, kung titignan natin yung halimbawa, yung kay Sebastian de Totanes, kung makikita mo, parang nag-create ng isang kwento, no? Nagsama pa kayo ng isang babae, sa inyong pagsasama ay naglaro pa kayo. Sa inyong paglalaro ay nilabasan pa kayo ng marumi. Okay? So, ano ba yung gustong sabihin? Ang daming pwedeng isipin sa kung ano yung pwedeng isagot. Oo, hindi. Pero ano ba ibig sabihin nun? So, ibig sabihin, sa huli, hanggang sa pagsapit ng ika-19 taon, yung mga komentaryo na ito mula doon sa pagiging matalino dahil sa para sa pagbubuo ng kontradiksyon hanggang dito sa tawag dito mga kontradiksyon na hindi specific kung kaligiran, hindi makahanap na specific kung kaligiran ng kasalanan. Inuulit lang yan hanggang ika-19 taon, hanggang 19th century. At hanggang sa pinakahuli na makikita mo ng 19th century sa eve ng revolution, and even yung sinasabi tungkol sa mga revolusyonaryo mula sa halimbawa kay Padre Prada, ganon din yung kay yung sa Agustino kay Padre Prada, yung kay sa Dominico si Ulpiano Herrero, yung sinasabi na mga braille na ito tungkol doon sa mga Pilipino ay actually katulad pa rin o mahihinuha pa rin yung traces nitong ganitong kaisipan na sila ay puno ng kontradiksyon. So, ngayon, of course, ay ano ba yung dahilan o bakit gano'n yung kontradiksyon? Siguro, magandang maunawaan natin ito mula sa kung paano dumaloy o paano nabuo yung kaisipan, particular halimbawa sa kasalanan at kung ano yung tama o mali. No? At dyan ay pinapanukala ko ang makikita ninyong balangkas sa inyong screen, no? Sa inyong harapan. No? Una, yung kasaysayan ng Kristyanisasyon sa Pilipinas ay kakakitaan natin ng 3 linya ng salaysay. Ang una ay yung tinatawag kung maitasabi ko na salaysay na panlipunan. Yung ikalawa ay yung salaysay na eklesyastiko at ang ikatlo ay yung salaysay na sibil. So, alam ko na iniisip natin na yung salaysay na eklesyastiko at salaysay na sibil ay actually magkapareho. Kasi usually yung sinasabi natin is that magkaisa o nagkakaisa lang yung kaisipan, no? Ng tawag dito o nagkakaisa yung pamahalaan at yung simbahan panahon na yon. Pero kung titingnan natin yung linya o daloy ng mga salaysay, napaka-logical lang ng kanilang pagkakaisa. Logical, ibig sabihin, nag-i-exist lang. Well, hindi naman paano pala. So sabihin, de jure, by law, siguro, nagkakaisa. Pero, kung titingnan ninyo yung kilos ng dalawa, makikita nyo magkahiwalay sila. So much so that there are times na yung mga arsobispo ay i-excommunicate nilang gobernador general. Yung namang gobernador general ay i-exile yung arsobispo. Ano? So parang nag-aaway din sila at meron silang kanya-kanyang sagwan doon sa daloy ng kasaysayan. Samantala, naiiwan yung sa lipunan. Okay? At of course, kung titingnan natin kung ano yung tama pamumuhay dito sa 3 ito, makakakita rin tayo ng pagkakaiba. Una ay yung paglilingkod sa sibil ay nakikita nila na ang tamang buhay ay actually paglilingkod sa monarkiya. In its simplest form. No? Susunod ka sa hari at reyna. That's it. Tapos, of course, ay yung salaysay na eklesyastiko, of course, ang nakikita nila ay hindi dapat, no, na magkaroon ng superstisyones, ng mga abusos, at yung lalong-lalo na yung infieles. Na yung infieles ay tinutukoy nila dyan, hindi lang yung mga tao na katulad ng mga Muslim o ng, marami sila tinutukoy ng mga Hudyo, no? Kundi yung mga tao na basta in general ay hindi tumatanggap sa Kristyanismo. Subalit iba yung iniisip ng salipunan sa Pilipino, mga Indio. Kasi ang mahalaga sa kanila na kaisipan is yung pakikipagkapwa sa anito at pakikipagkapwa. At yung pakikipagkapwa sa anito ay nag-extend towards sa pakikipagkapwa sa pinuno at yung pinuno at patuloy yan na nag-extend doon sa pakikipagkapwa sa bayan. Okay? Ngayon, mag-i-introduce ng tawag dito, itong dalawang ito, itong salaysay na eklesiastik at salaysay na sibil, ay magpapakilala ng isang bagong nakaraan. Okay? Papakilala ng sibil ang krimen pag hindi ka sumunod. At of course, yung pag hindi ka naman sumunod sa eklesiastiko, ang iyan ay kasalanan. Okay? At of course, ay ibibigay nila ito para sa bayan, sa lipunan, para sa ganon ay magkaroon sila ng bagong pananampalataya. Pero solely, yung bagong pananampalataya ay magiging pamamaraan para makabaligwas yung bayan dito sa eklesiastiko at maging sa civil. Not so much siguro dito, pero let's see. No? Ngayon, sa lipunan, this is an extension of bakit salaysay na panlipunan, nandito yung tao at mamamayan, at ang nakagitnang konsepto sa kanila is of course yung pakikipagkapwa. At ang pakikipagkapwa ay diretso, of course, unang-una sa mga anito. At even yung mga anito ay hindi nakikita, ang mahalaga natin isipin is that yung mga anito ay kinikilala bilang mga anito. Nagpapatuloy ang kanilang buhay kahit hindi sila nakikita. Subalit ang mahalaga ay makita na maunawaan natin na maaring o dapat din makipagkapwa sa kanila sapagkat sila ay hindi iba doon sa tao. Sapagkat yung tao may kaluluwa, may kalooban. Ang anito ay may kaluluwa rin, kaluluwa nga siya at may kalooban. And of course ay hindi siya dapat sinasaktan, hindi siya dapat binabastos, kaya kailangan nagtatabi-tabi po. At sa dami ng lahat ng mga anito sa paligid, mula sa taas ng sa bubong ng bahay, sa sahig, sa ilalim, sa mga poste, no? Hanggang sa hagdanan, sa taas, sa baba, sa bakod, sa bukid, sa parang, kailangan mo ng isang tao na napakagalang. Isang tao na kumikilala doon sa kanilang pagdiral na hindi mananakit sa kanila. Kaya nabuo yung kaisipan na dapat yung tao ay nakikipagkapwa sa ito. Sapagkat kung hindi ka makapagkapwa, kung bastusin mo, hindi ka nagtabi-tabi po, halimbawa ay umihi ka. So, for the example, umihi ka sa isang puno o sa isang bunso, sinasabi nila mamamagka. No? Mamamagka yung tunod. So anyways, the thing is, pakikipagkapwa yung lahat sa anito. Nag-extend yan sa pinuno, maayos na pakikipagkapwa sa pinuno, at yung pinuno ay maayos din pakikipagkapwa sa kanyang mga tauhan. Kaya yung pinuno ay tagapagpalaganap ng kaginawahan. And of course, bayan doon sa ibang pangkat. No? Nakikipagkapwa rin sa ibang pangkat, lalo sa individual tungo sa malaking bayan na yun. Now, kaayusang panlipunan at kaginhawang panlahat. Iyon ay yung pakikipagkapwa ay nakatuon lahat doon sa ganon. Maayos na lipunan at kaginhawahan ng lahat ng tao o ng lahat ng mga tao at maging yung mga ito. At kung hindi maganap yun, iyon yung sala. Okay? Yung sala ay, of course, ibig sabihin, sala ay hindi tumama. Okay? So halimbawa, kung ikaw ay papana, kung ikaw ay basketball, shoot ka, hindi na shoot sala. Okay? So ibig sabihin, pero ang ano doon, ang catch doon is that kung hindi po sumala man, pwede mong ulitin na hindi na sumala. No? So, which is could be an entirely different concept mula doon sa i-introduce, ipapakilala ng mga Kastila. No? So, and let's continue. No? So, Sa salaysay na eklesyastiko, yung kaisipan is actually galing doon sa evolution ng concept ng kung ano yung kasalanan. No? Yung original na Greek is hamantulos, yung makasalanan, peccator, or sa Latin, pecador, sa Espanyol, and ang translation dito is of course makasalanan. So basically, yung mga tao therefore ay mga infieles. No? So sila ay actually mga hamartulos, hamartuloy. No? At pecadores, no? Mga makasalanan. Which is always nandoon sa mga platikas mula doon sa kay Blancas de San Jose, Juan de Oliver at hanggang sa panahon halimbawa ng 19th century kay Pumarada na Francisca naman. Okay? And then, of course, ipapakilala nila yung bagong nakaraan. Dahil nga kayo ay mga martuloy, kayo ay mga pecadores na pakasalanan. Kayo ay isang bayang nasa dilim. Kayo ay isang bayang hawak ng demonyo. At kayo isang bayang dapat linisin. Ang bayang sala sa lahat. Walang tama sa inyo. So bagong kasalukuyan, bayang nilinis sa kasalanan. Bayan ng Diyos. Sapagkat dumating na yung Kristyanismo. No? So yun yung kumbaga. Kaso, of course, ay iba kasi yung hamartuloy, iba yung peccator, iba yung pecador. No? Sabi, iba yung mga concepts yan. Kasi, siguro yung closest na concept doon sa kasalanan is actually hamartia. Kasi yung hamartia, pero of course yung association na rin hamartia, yung masasama eh. Pero yung original concept kasi yung parang yung arrow na hindi tumama sa target. Of course, yung pecador ay iba yung iba yung kahulugan. Kasi and officially, iyan ay mga something na dumudumi o nagbibigay ng lubos na karumihan doon sa iyong kaluluwa. Which is different doon sa kasalanan, which is very social. No? Ngayon, yung Diyos na ngayon nakakalinis ng kasalanan. Okay? Pero of course, merong ritual mediated ng confession. Ibig sabihin, magkaiba yung dalawang concept. Now anyways, so sa civil, sa salaysay na civil naman, is of course, again, mga infieles ang tawag nila. Pero walang pakialam talaga dyan yung the only reason kung bakit kailangan i-Christianize yung mga tao mula sa punto de vista civil is para makapagbigay ng isang ideolohiya o ideological na pundasyon sa pagkakaisa ng mga tao. Okay? Dahil kung may political na pagkakaisa which is galing sa monarkiya, meron din dapat ideological na pagkakaisa bunga o para sa tinatawag na o bunga ng kaisipan na Kristiyano. Okay? Again, mentality yun noong kongkista at pre-kongkista. Ngayon, yung bagong nakaraan na inintroduce ng sibil sa mga Pilipino is that yung sinasabi nila na kayo ay isang bayang walang batas, bayang walang pamahalaan, walang kalinangan, walang kaayusan. Now, of course, ano ba yung dapat? Okay? Paglilingkod sa monarkiya. And of course, kayong mga tao, fieles ay dapat, kayong mga tao ay dapat maglingkod sa monarkiya kasi nga ganito yung inyong nakaraan. Wala kayong batas, wala kayong pamahalaan, walang kalinangan, walang kaayusan. At of course, ito ay yung kasalukuyan. Therefore, yung kasalukuyan mo is that ikaw ay kinupkup na ng hari at ng reyna o ng reyna at o ng reyna. At kung ikaw ay hindi sumunod sa kanila, ang ginagawa mo ay isang malaking krimen. Okay? Now, pagsapit na ika-19 na taon, ay yung tatlong tatlong mga ano na ito, tatlong linya ng salaysay, no? Ay yung sa pakikipagkapwa, mga makasalanan, mga kriminal, ay makikita na yung lipunan, yung salaysay ng lipunan ay magdodomina dito sa salaysay na eklesiastiko at salaysay na civil. Ibig sabihin, yung pakikipagkapwa, ito pa rin yung mangunguna over doon sa konsepto ng pekado, pekador, pekator, no? Lahat. Over at again doon sa krimen. So siya ang titingnan pa rin ng bayan, ng lipunan, ng mga Pilipino is actually yung kahalagahan ng pakikipagkapwa. Okay? At of course, yung kasalanan at krimen na ito ay actually makikita nila bilang panlaban sa kawalang pakikipagkapwa ng mga kolonisador. Okay, so tawag dyan, ang nakita sa pakikipagkapwa is nagpatuloy yung pakikipagkapwa at napakahalaga ng pakikipagkapwa. Pero ang nakita is of course yung kawalan ng pakikipagkapwa noong colonizer. Okay? At of course, kung inintroduce man nila yung makasalanan, yung makasalanan ay bagamat nandoon yung konsepto na kailangan mo mag-purify, magtika, no? Yung makasalanan ay nananatili pa rin doon sa level na kaisipan na kawalan ng pakikipagkapwa. At ganoon din yung pagiging isang kriminal. Okay? Kaya kung sisingilin man ng mga tao, ay iyon ay bunga ng yung kanilang pakikipaglaban sa kolonisador ay actually nakikita bilang isang pagsubil sa kawalan ng pakikipagkapwa. So ang himagsikan ay actually isang malaking pakikipaglaban para sa patuloy na pakikipagkapwa. Okay? Now, so bilang konklusyon, para matapos na po tayo, magkaiba ang kaisipan sa likod ng kasalanan ng pekado. Ang kasalanan ay ang di tamang pakikipagkapwa at ang pagsasabi sa ayos nito ay ang pagbabalik sa muling
history and at the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. So in terms of her background, her educational background. She finished her PhD, her MPhil, and her MA at the University of Columbia, all in cultural anthropology. And she finished her BA at the University of Washington, also in cultural anthropology. So her research interests in general are related to the Philippines, Southeast Asian studies, history, and the anthropology of Christianity, with a particular focus on Catholicism. But besides this, she also holds an interest in cultures of the mass media, in historiography, ethnography, conversations in colonial and post-colonial societies, US imperialism, archive studies, and global occultisms and New Age studies. So for today, we're going to have a presentation that was pre-prepared by Dr. De La Cruz. Sir Alec, are you ready with the recording po natin? All right, so while we're preparing the recording, we would like to, ayun, sige.
Hello everyone. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is where you're watching. My name is Deirdre De La Cruz. I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I am coming to you from a Zoom recording. I apologize, I cannot join you in the live session. As I will be when you meet on the road. It's good to be there nonetheless, and I encourage anyone who has any questions or corrections or comments or suggestions to email me at this email address here if you have any thoughts on what I'm about to present. So this is one piece of a bigger book project called Spirits in the New Age, that takes a long 20th century look at alternative spiritual and religious movements in the Philippines as they intersect with and influence esoteric and New Age discourses and practices worldwide. What I'm sharing, some of what I'm sharing at least, is in progress. And so, again, I welcome your thoughts. I wanted to start with a little bit of an origin story to the project on the whole, and something to which I will refer again at the end of the presentation. And it is this album of Fotografías Espíritas, is what it says here, or spirit photographs that were published in an album in Barcelona in around between 1903 and 1905. Why is this important? Because in this album, again published in Barcelona, we find several spirit photographs that were taken in Manila in the first years of the 20th century. Now, I got this photo album, or I first received JPEGs of these spirit photos from my friend and mentor, Bill Christian. And I was completely aghast because although I knew that spirit photography was a very popular phenomenon in the United States and other places in the 19th century, it was the first time that I had seen any evidence of it in the Philippines. So I subsequently did research on this specific album in Barcelona and uncovered its history. There is an article that I wrote about that I'm happy to share with anyone who's interested. The reason why I opened the presentation with this is because it kind of outlines what I think is really the point of the history I want to tell, at least today, which is that Filipino spiritism, espiritismo, anytime you see the term espiritista, that in its history, it's actually embedded in these much wider kind of global networks of publication and correspondence and spiritism writ large. So to contextualize what I want to talk about today, apart from opening with this little bit of an origin story, I need to zoom out to look at what is the global history of Spiritism. And for that, we need to go to the United States. I'm sorry, I didn't talk much about this. This is one of the photographs that was in the album. It is of Salvador Pons, who any of you familiar with the historiography on the secular clergy will recognize as somebody who turned away from the Catholic Church, was an apostate, or was an Augustinian, turned away from the church, got involved in the secular clergy movement, in the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, got involved in Spiritism, and then went back to the church. But that's a story for another time. In any case, in order to understand Filipino Spiritism, and especially the Unión Espiritista Cristiana, I need to zoom out a little bit and tell you about the global context and the global history of Spiritism more broadly. Now, the origins of modern spiritualism or Spiritism almost always traces itself back to one family, a pair of sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, who on March night in 1848 took it upon themselves to do something about the mysterious rapping noises that had disturbed their family and even previous tenants of the home. They performed a sort of call and response of rappings in which they posed a series of questions to which the mysterious entity rapped back, once for yes and two for no. From here, spiritualism spread like wildfire. Of course, there's a lot more to this, but just for expediency's sake, spiritualism in the United States spread like wildfire. It became this incredibly spectacle-oriented practice. Channeling spirits, attracted huge audiences. It sometimes also produced opportunities for more the promotion of more radical causes. Now, eventually, spiritualism traversed the Atlantic, and wherever it landed in Europe, it localized to that particular political and social context. So in Victorian England, spiritualism was very much a kind of bourgeois drawing room pastime. In France, it was the same, until a person came along named Hippolyte Rival, who was a French educator born to a middle-class family in Lyon, and wrote under the name of Allan Kardec. He is thought of as the founder of Spiritism. He is also known for what one historian calls making the seance serious. Over the course of the couple of years that Kardec conducted his own kind of experiments in communicating with the dead, which I should actually say is at the center of Spiritism, right? The techniques in communicating with the spirits of the deceased. Over the course of a couple of years that Kardec conducted seances, he kind of collected information from the spirit world that he would then codify as a kind of belief system and a spiritual science, he called it, and a doctrine that he put into a book in 1857 titled Le Livre d'Esprit, or the Spirit's Book. It was wildly popular within about almost 20 years. It had gone through 22 editions. So spiritualism, United States, Spiritism would be anyone who was an adherent of Kardec's philosophy and doctrine, whereas a spiritualist could be anyone who believed in the existence of something beyond the material. Broadly speaking, what Kardec did was he codified communication with the beyond into these various tomes of doctrine that he then called Spiritism or Spiritisme or Espiritismo, which is how it is articulated in the Philippines. Now, in France, Spiritism was very much at odds with Catholicism, but not nearly as much as it was at odds with the Catholic Church in Spain. And the tensions between the church and Spiritist groups was much more pronounced, in particular after the Bourbon Restoration in 1874. Spiritism was a regular target of Catholic vitriol, and Spiritists responded in kind, rejecting first Catholic dogma and authority, and then political positions tied to those beliefs. So in the Spanish Spiritist context, we see a real coherent kind of political dissident identity to Spiritism that we hadn't really seen anywhere before. This is going to be important for when we think about, Spiritism in the Philippines. In any case, Spiritism moved from the European context via late colonial routes throughout the world, localizing in places like Vietnam, where it integrated into the new religion known as Cao Dai in the early 20th century. That was founded in, actually not the early 20th century, founded in 1926. Vietnamese civil servants who were engaged in the kind of seance practices from French Spiritism basically created this new religion, at the center of which was spirit mediumship. And in places like Brazil, Spiritism caught on, was just wildly popular and became almost like a sort of civic religion. Spiritists in Brazil, even to this day, are engaged in a lot of sort of charitable works. They build hospitals. They build other kinds of, support other kinds of social services, etc. So as we can see, Spiritism was really a global thing, again, taking on very particular characteristics wherever it landed. Where the Philippines is concerned, there is no one moment we can point to as the first encounter of Filipinos with Kardec's texts and with Espiritismo. We know that it, was, we know that Espiritismo among Filipinos was associated with political dissent, that it was perceived as threatening to the Catholic Church. As early as 1890, the Revista Católica de Filipinas published a series of articles about Espiritismo that very much sort of decried the practice. There's another source that puts Isabelo de los Reyes at a demonstration in Barcelona in 1898, a demonstration that was composed of a number of really radical political groups and organizations, including the Cartesian Spiritists Union. So there's no, primal scene for when, Espiritismo catches on among the sort of ilustrado class, and that would have been, the class that would have likely have had exposure to it. It could have traveled via a number of late Spanish colonial routes by ilustrados, returning from the peninsula by peninsula visitors to Spain. What we do know is that by the early 20th century, Filipino Spiritists are translating and some of Allan Kardec's works into local languages, or republishing his works in Spanish in the Philippines. We know that Philippine-based Spiritists are corresponding with their brethren Spiritists in the Hispanophone world, including with Amalia Domingo Soler, who was the woman in the slide here. So we know that there were Spiritists in the Philippines who were communicating with her via letters. And we know, again, based on the evidence of the spirit photographs, that spiritists in the Philippines were enthusiastically taking up and implementing the latest globally circulating techniques and technologies of spirit mediumship. What's clear is that, this is all kind of happening in the late 19th century, at the turn of the 20th century, just as there is this, of course, transition of colonial powers. And in this historical milieu, there are two figures who are crucial to the establishment of Espiritismo as a kind of organized movement committed to spreading Kardec's knowledge throughout the Philippines. And these two people are Agustin de la Rosa and Juan Alvillar, Rosa of Manila and Juan Alvillar of San Fabian, Pangasinan. Now, we might trace de la Rosa's engagement with Espiritismo back to his involvement in another major 19th century movement, that of Freemasonry. Along with the artisan Estanislao Legazpi, de la Rosa established the Masonic Lodge Integridad Español, number 212 in Manila. And de la Rosa served as a bookkeeper for La Liga Filipina, and was apparently present at the first meeting convened by Rizal in 1892. By 1900, de la Rosa had established the first Spiritist center in Manila, and over the next few years, other chapters spread throughout nearby provinces of Bulacan, Pampanga, Cavite, Laguna, Batangas, Quezon, etc. Now, in a parallel development, contemporaneous with what de la Rosa is propagating in Manila, further north in the province of Pangasinan, Juan Alvillar had founded another Spiritist center known as La Perseverancia in the oceanside town of San Fabian. Juan Alvillar was a public figure. He was a provincial elite. He was a one-time governor of the province. There are some, like Dr. Nemilda Flores, that has suggested that he played an instrumental role in the founding of UP. In any case, he was an avowed spiritist, and chapters inspired by the Spiritist Center in San Fabian then spread east and north through Pangasinan and Ilocos, all the way to Benguet and Nueva Vizcaya and other locations in that part of Luzon. So as you can see, Espiritismo, especially of this brand that really based itself in the writings, either translated into Spanish or translated into Philippine languages, the writings of Allan Kardec, that this brand of Espiritismo or Spiritism was one that belonged to the intelligentsia. It was one that was continuous with other 19th century movements like Freemasonry, freethinking, theosophy, and so forth. In 1905, de la Rosa and Alvillar would join forces and establish together the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas, which 4 years later they would incorporate in accordance with the Philippine laws under the American colonial administration. Now, before going on to say a little bit more about the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas, I want to linger a little bit on a story that I was told by one of Juan Alvillar's descendants, which I think reveals something of how Christianity was articulated to the spiritual science of Espiritismo, because this is one of the most, I think, fascinating aspects of Espiritismo in the Philippines is that, like Spiritism elsewhere, it localizes, it takes on, the kind of cultural aspects, right, of the local context, and this is no exception. So I want to say a little bit about how, at least according to one story, Christianity was articulated to the spiritual science of Espiritismo. And for this, I have to flash forward, zoom through the 20th century and all the way to 2017, when I went to San Fabian to interview current members of the Unión Espiritista Cristiana at their Centro La Perseverancia, which still exists to this day. At one of the meetings I had with some members there, I was fortunate to meet Juan Alviar's grandson, the gentleman you see here, Alexis Alviar Ursais, who at the time was 72 years old and one of 7 of Don Juan Alviar's grandchildren. Now, at the meeting that I had, the interview that I took with Hermano Alexis, Spiritists now, as in the past, refer to one another and want to be referred to as hermano or hermana. So at our meeting, Hermano Alexis described to me his family tree, his siblings who were still alive, who had deceased. He described how his mother was one of 2 daughters from Juan Alviar's second marriage to a local woman from San Fabian. But then he described how before he was married to his grandmother, Juan Alviar was married to a Portuguese woman from the southern Tagalog province of Quezon, whose name was Maria Panchacola. Now, according to the story that Hermano Alexis told me, Juan Alviar's first wife, Panchacola, got sick. And Juan Alviar prayed and prayed for her to get better, but to no avail. She succumbed to her illness. And again, according to the story, Juan Alviar, who at one point it was told had gone to seminary to become a priest, saw Catholicism for what it was, which was, according to him, nothing but ivory, wood, and stone. This is, of course, referring to the rebulto, the Catholic images. So, as Hermano Alexis told me, Juan Alviar gathered all of the images before which he had fervently prayed, and he burned them. And as the idols blazed, he was seized by the Holy Spirit and was instructed to organize a group of men and women for whom God was spirit in its highest form. Now, as an ilustrado statesman and educator, Juan Alviar was not given over to a totalizing Pentecostal worldview, but rather tempered his fervor by subsuming his obedience to the Holy Spirit under the highly codified system of Spiritism as developed by French pedagogue Allan Kardec. This resulted in the unique blend of science and the supernatural that formed the Unión Espiritista Cristiana, whose members even now revere Kardec as their príncipe and Juan Alviar as kind of an originary medium. A medium whose combined philosophical orientation and Christian ethos is evidenced in the first of their 7 doctrines, Hacia Dios por la ciencia y el amor, or towards God through science and love. Now, I haven't found any sources to corroborate Hermano Alexis' story, and it may just be kind of family lore, right? Even so, the story of Juan Alviar's conversion, or rather his kind of apostasy, speaks volumes, I think, about how the cosmopolitan French-derived movement of Espiritismo became distinctly Filipino. For one, Catholicism plays a big role here, even if it's ultimately turned away from. It is the de facto belief system, the praxis. Praying before the rebulto was the default to which Juan Alviar made recourse when he was in the tragic situation of dealing with his wife's illness. Furthermore, the circumstances of this turn to the Holy Spirit. At the center of it is a scene of healing or a failed healing, right? And this is important, I think, because if there's one thing that really distinguishes Filipino spiritism from other manifestations or expressions of spiritism elsewhere, it is that healing is a central aspect of it. Healing is a central aspect of it. I was even told that Juan Alvear himself was a very talented healer, that he was able to heal through magnetism, which is, again, another popular sort of 19th century practice of healing based on the ideas that all living entities, from humans to things in nature, possess a sort of magnetic fluid that can be manipulated to therapeutic effect. In any case, later on in the 1950s, members of the Unión Espiritista would come to perform what some would call material operation. And though I don't have the space to talk about it here, one of the things that I want to do with the bigger book project is to trace Espiritismo from these turn of the 20th century movements and expressions through to 20th century forms of Filipino faith healing, and especially the phenomenon of psychic surgery that achieved global fame in the 1970s and 80s. That is well beyond the scope of what I can say here. But suffice it to say, one of the things that makes Espiritismo Filipino is its emphasis on the Holy Spirit, its placement of the Holy Spirit in the kind of order of the spirit world, which follows the codification that was set up by Kardec, but that nevertheless puts the Holy Spirit at the center of it, or at the apex of it, as well as the centrality of healing to Espiritist practice that I think makes it quite unique, and one of the things that I pursue in the more extensive research. So, like everything else, Espiritismo, when it came to the Philippines, it adapted, it localized, it kind of navigated different colonial powers. And to wrap up, or to segue here towards the end, I want to give one more example of that kind of adaptation, localization, and negotiation by looking at the incorporation of the Unión Espiritista Cristiana in 1909, which offers an interesting look into how spiritual movements responded to American colonialism. Now, as anthropologist Scott McLaughlin has shown, corporate legislation in the early 20th century was introduced as a powerful colonial technology that was brought to bear on religious communities in hitherto unseen ways. Putting an ink on its now combined and coordinated chapters, which at this point had been established as far as the Visayas, served to further legitimize the existence of the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas in the eyes of the colonial state. However, a close look at the Unión Espiritista Cristiana statutes reveals this to be far more than just a bureaucratization of their community. So we're going to take a look at a few of their bylaws here as they were published in 1909, which is the same year that they were incorporated, and notice a few very interesting things about them. So in the second chapter of their bylaws, they have a section that's called spiritual direction. So this, would outline what the kind of spiritual direction of their organization would take. And we see here that the spirits themselves, los espíritus son los únicos que dirigen los trabajos de la asociación bajo la denominación de dirección espiritual. So basically, the spirits themselves are the only ones that can direct the association's work, their effort, beneath the designation of the spiritual director or the spiritual direction. So figure this for a second. These are the not necessarily the articles of incorporation, but these are the bylaws that are established once the Unión Espiritista Cristiana incorporates, right? And who is at the center, or as, you know, as important agents as the members of the Unión Espiritista, no less than the spirits that they channel, right? Here is the section of the bylaws that describe the Unión Espiritista's organization. So the association is organized in the following manner, and then you have these different, I guess, sort of sections or kind of organizational structure here that starts with the general center and then a board of directors and various councils. What's interesting to me that I want to point out is that of the general center of the association, or the Unión Espiritista Cristiana, what you have is a staff that is comprised first and foremost of 2 or 3 spirit mediums. These are the mediums de aparato de comunicación, and that they depend directly on the spiritual direction, which we learned was basically determined by the spirits that are being channeled, and that even the staff is determined or is basically chosen by the spiritual direction for the length of time, for an undetermined length of time, and that only the secretary serves for a specific length of time. And that is because they are taking their instructions from the spirits themselves that they are channeling. And later on, further down in the bylaws, we see here that the spiritual direction, in other words, the spirits, are the only ones competent to modify the very bylaws that are being outlined here, right? According to any circumstances that might arise from the progress of the association. So this is fascinating to me. It's basically taking what is a highly routinized, kind of bureaucratized, rationalized order of the corporation and turning it a little on its head, or at least making space in it for the agency of spirits. Here we see spirits as both kind of subjects and agents of corporatization. And the reason why this interests me is because in general, you know, in the history and in its present, I think that the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas is one of these communities, one of these entities, one of these organizations, movements. So places a lot of emphasis on healing, which is something that Kardec doesn't do. And not all spiritist groups around the world do this. And this is in a lot of ways, you know, decidedly Filipino, and even the ways that they describe how healing works follows along certain highly local logics of like hot and cold, right? And you know, even as it's incorporated as a religious organization in the early 20th century, the members of the Unión Espiritista Cristiana to this day are adamant that theirs is not a religion, but a relationship. So hindi ang religion, kundi ang relasyon to God through the spirits, right? in describing their places of meeting, they reject the vernacular term for church. So they would never use the term simbahan to describe their place of meeting. They prefer to use instead the term for center, right, lunduyan, and they frequently use the term samahan to as a kind of self-descriptor rather than use any term that might describe a community of worship. In other words, Filipino Christian Spiritists challenge some of the predominant narratives, I think, of the Philippines evangelization because it draws so wildly from local repertoires of belief and practice, but also global movements of 19th century esotericism. Okay, sorry, I had to pause there for a second. So just to wrap up with some conclusions here. Okay. First of all, and I think this is like the most basic thing I would want to get across, that espiritismo or espiritista, when you hear the term, it's not, at least in its kind of genealogical origins, it is not a pre-colonial form of spirit mediumship. But it is a movement of religious modernity. It only dates back in the way that the kind that I'm describing only dates back to the 19th century. And not only does it only date back to the 19th century, but emerges out of a broader history of global 19th century esotericism. It disrupts the teleology of Spanish Catholic and American Protestant evangelization because of how it understands itself as a kind of codified spiritual science, right? And therefore it requires different geographical and even theological frameworks for its understanding. And to illustrate this last point, I want to just return to go full circle and look at something I found when I was trying to learn more about the album of spirit photographs. And this is a popular magazine known as Caras y Caretas in Argentina in 1904, which was soon after the album of spirit photographs was published. And what should you have in it? But lo and behold, the spirit photographs that were taken in Manila. Now, there are a couple ways to think about this. One is that, you know, whoever's writing this feature for this magazine in Buenos Aires is just kind of flattening, all spirit photographs into like one feature and not making any, basically not being a good, not doing proper sourcing. Because we know that these pictures were not taken in Buenos Aires. We know that they were taken in the Philippines. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it's speaking to a broader transnational or supranational network of spiritists around the world, of which Filipino spiritists, including the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas, considers itself a part. So, trying to think of different sort of geographical frameworks, and not only geographical frameworks, but to think of different global imaginaries, I guess, within which these movements circulate that are not necessarily bound to place or nation or colony, I think is one thing that I want us to take from this history and that I want to explore further in this research that I'm doing. So thank you very much for listening. Maraming salamat po. And if you have any questions, again, please do email me. And I would love to hear from any of you who are out there and have something to say about this research. Thank you and good day.
Deidre de la Cruz. For anyone who had questions about her presentation, perhaps what you could do is look up our live stream feeds and then go back to the part where she introduces her topic so you can find her email there at the bottom. This goes for both our Zoom attendees as well as those watching through our live sessions on Facebook. So really fascinating there how the Philippine tradition of spiritism and occultism is distinguishable though within these global lines. But we don't have much time to talk about that right now. I encourage everyone to collect their questions and plug them into our chat box down below or in our Q&A box. So we're gonna move on to our next speaker for today. And this is Father Michael Layugan. I just want to check if Father Layugan is with us right now. Can you hear us, Po?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay, Po. Let me introduce you first and then we can begin your lecture. Okay, so let me down here. Opo. So Father Layugan's presentation today is entitled The Third Wave of the Evangelization of the Philippines. Now, Father Layugan, who has a PhD in philosophy and is also a doctor in sacred theology, has been educated across many institutions in the Philippines and Europe, most recently earning his PhD and his STHDs at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. So he is a member of the Society of the Divine Word, and was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1999. So currently, he is the Dean of Studies and Registrar, as well as a professor at the Divine Word Seminary in Tagaytay. Now, his research interests include philosophy, church history, Philippine history, and Philippine church history in particular, as well as missiology, cultural anthropology, archives and record management, Cordillera culture and history, Kalinga culture and history, and congregational historiography. Now, without any further ado, Father, you may begin your presentation na po. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much and good morning. Magandang umaga. Can you see the presentation, the screen?
Yes, sir, we can. Oh.
Good morning. Can you see the screen?
Yes, Father, we can see the screen.
Miss Jiraya, can you see the screen? Is it okay?
Yes, sir. It's very clear, Paul.
Okay. So I will now start. My topic for today is on the third wave of the evangelization of the Philippines. This is not the third wave of the pandemic, but this is the third wave of evangelization. I have here the periodization of evangelization of the Philippines, and I use the four waves. The first wave in 1521, the second wave between 1565 and 1898, the third wave 1898 and 1965, and the fourth wave will be 1965. So I'm interested in the third wave, which is between 1898 and 1965, but we will also tackle the first two waves because they are very important in the understanding of the third wave. The third wave is very important because here there is a changed historical context. So it is no longer the monopoly of the Catholic Church, but evangelization is now the Christian churches, or we call them the denominations. Let me first talk about the problematics in Philippine historiography. First of all is the reliance on documentary sources. Who are the writers? Who are those who wrote the reports, especially during the Spanish period? They were the colonizers, the foreigners. But what about Filipino Christians, those who were converted into the faith? Do we have documentary evidence? Where are the documentary sources? How will an ordinary Filipino historian finance research overseas? Like, for instance, most of the documents are in Spain, and you also have many documents at the Vatican archives. Then the second is the state of Philippine archives. When we write the history, our even local history, we need sources. Unfortunately, we depend on documentary sources. And situation in which we find our archives, parish archives, congregational archives, diocesan archives, even our national archives. Who goes to these archives? They prefer to do research using published literature. So they go to the library and then do research, and that's it, without going to the primary sources. And these primary sources are found in congregational archives, and I have seen the problem, especially the state of their archives. Then the next is on oral tradition. Can we use oral tradition in the writing of historiography, especially when we talk about the the Spanish period? The problem here is the question of reliability and also the time frame. Who will tell us what exactly took place after more than 300 years? So these are the problematics in Philippine history. So now let's go to the first wave of evangelization in 1521. What do we know about this wave? So first of all, this bull issued by Pope Alexander VI, Inter Cetera, important in the understanding of why Spain came to the Philippines. The papacy entrusted to the Spanish crown the evangelization of the colonies of Spain. The crown entrusted the task of evangelization So here is the famous Ferdinand Magellan and the Magellan expedition. This is the route of the voyage from Seville, Spain. The account of the circumnavigation of the world was chronicled by Antonio Pigafetta. So it is through Antonio Pigafetta that we come to know about what happened in 1521. So this is where they embarked. They set off from Seville, Spain. Concerning evangelization, here are some of the features that took place in 1521. First is the Easter Sunday Mass on the 31st of March, 1521, when Magellan early in the morning sent the chaplain, Father Pedro Valderrama, ashore to celebrate the Mass. This is so far the recorded celebration of the Mass on land. Now there are debates concerning where it took place, the first Mass took place, when it took place. There are still some debates, but I think if we follow the account of Pigafetta, this is the date given. So the captain together with 50 men went ashore, and during the Mass, you have here there are two Rajas, Colombo and Ayo, who went to kiss the cross. So I quote from Pigafetta's account, at the elevation of the body of our Lord, they knelt as we did and worshiped our Lord with clasped hands. So this is Carlos Botong Francisco's depiction of the first Mass. Then another important date on evangelization is on Sunday, 7 April 1521, when Magellan and his crew at noon entered the port of Cebu. And Cebu during that time was a trading port. On Sunday, the 14th of April, 1521, quote from Pigafetta's account, we went ashore being 40 men of whom 2 armed men marched in front with the banner of our emperor. Magellan instructed King Humabon of Cebu about the faith. So it was not Father Pedro Valderrama, but it was Magellan. So you see also the problematic here is Magellan could not speak the local language. And so most probably he made use of an interpreter. And you can have wild imaginations on how the interpreter or the translator translated the words of Magellan. Magellan set up a big cross in the center of the square, exhorting the king that if he wished to be a good Christian, he must burn all the idols. So this is the famous, this is not the real cross, but the replica of the cross in Cebu. Another important event related to evangelization is the baptism of the king. Magellan took the king by the hand and they went up on the platform. And when he came to baptize him, he told him that he would name him Carlos, as was the name of the emperor. The prince was named Ferran. So were baptized before the mass 50 men. After dinner, the chaplain and some others went to baptize the queen, who came with 40 ladies. There were gifts given to the queen. Now, these gifts are important because this will be, one of them will be discovered in 1565. The queen was given a statue of Our Lady with a child and a cross. She was also given the statue of the Santo Niño. Magellan, knowing that the wooden image greatly pleased the queen, gave it to her, saying that she should have it instead of her idols, for that it was the memorial and representation of the Son of God. On hearing this, the queen accepted it. And later, in 1565, the statue would be recovered by Legazpi. She was baptized Juana. Now, Juana is the mother queen. If only Juana, the one baptized, knew who Juana is, because she went crazy. I don't think that she will be happy about it. And some they gave the native name of the queen as Hara Humana. Now we do not have extant records that give us the real name of the queen, but she was baptized Juana. Then on that day, 800 people were baptized. Such a huge number to be baptized on that day. So this is a portrait of the queen. She's beautiful. So this is the famous Santo Niño. This is Lapu-Lapu, whom we will later on encounter. This is the Battle of Mactan. Following Magellan's death in Mactan in 1521, Juan Sebastian Elcano took command of the ship Victoria. Then they sailed back to Spain. The circumnavigation was completed by Elcano and a crew of 18 men in Victoria, returning to Spain on the 8th of September, 1522, after nearly 3 years. Okay. The first wave. So what are our observation wave? The first wave was a period of exploration. There was no systematic evangelization that was undertaken. Instruction was made through an interpreter. The baptism of the chief. Here, Magellan used the medieval principle of cuius regio, eius religio principle. That is, he who governs the territory decides its religion. So once you baptize the chief, the rest follow. The preparations before baptism were short, maybe a matter of hours. Magellan and his crew stayed in Cebu for less than a month, between 14th of April and 27th of April. Now that's important. So how can you have a thorough evangelization if you stayed there only for less than a month? That is why there is the superficiality of the acceptance of the faith. And we know that because of the tragic end of those who were left behind. The faith didn't last long. after 44 years, when Legazpi arrived, Legazpi encountered a hostile population. So that means that they were not fully evangelized. So this is, once again, this is Magellan's voyage around the world. Now let's talk about the second wave of evangelization. So there were different expeditions sent by the king. The only expedition that succeeded in colonizing the islands is the one by Legazpi. And Legazpi was accompanied by an Augustinian friar who survived the Loaiza expedition, Fray Andres de Urdaneta. Okay, this is Legazpi. Then what is important during the second wave is the finding on the 28th of April, 1565, Juan de Camus found a wooden box with a statue, not inside an aristocratic home or a church, but in a simple abode. Real evangelization began with the Legazpi expedition when they established Spanish settlements in Cebu in 1565 and in Manila in 1571 that marked the continuous Philippine-European relations. And the first organ was entrusted to the Augustinians. So this is that's Legazpi. Then another factor that aided evangelization during that period was the work of the regular orders. So there were 5 regular orders who were tasked to evangelize the local population. The Augustinians arrived in 1565, the Discalced Franciscans in 1577, the Jesuits in 1581, the Dominican Friars in 1587, and the Augustinian Recollects in 1606. Then later on would come the Benedictines and the Vincentians, but that would be towards the end of the Spanish rule. So here are the pictures of the Augustinians, here are the Franciscans, the Jesuits, the Dominicans. And this is the famous Ezequiel Moreno, who was canonized a saint, who belongs to the Recoletos. Of course, one of the things that is of the narrative of the work of the secular clergy. Secular clergy, these are known as the diocesan clergy. So they do not belong to a religious or a regular order. They do not have a regular or rule. Father Pedro Valderrama was the first Spanish secular priest to reach the Philippines. Then other secular priests were entrusted the care of the parishes. So they were called the cura parroco, to train local candidates as secular priests. Under the Spanish rule, education was the responsibility of the Catholic Church. So it was through the schools that religion was taught. So the schools were also aided. Then another very salient feature of this period was the founding of local congregations of women, the so-called Beaterio. The first one is the RVM, the Religious of the Virgin Mary, in 1684 by Mother Ignacia del Espiritu Santo. Then the Beaterio de Santa Catalina de Sena by Mother Francisca in 1696. And of course, from Bulacan, the Augustinian Recollect Sisters. So they arrived in Kalumpang in 1719. There were 2 sisters, Junicia Talangpas and Cecilia Rosa Talangpas. And this congregation still exists today. There were, besides the local Beaterios, there were congregations of Spanish nuns who arrived from Spain. So we have the nuns from St. Clare, Dominican nuns, Augustinian nuns, Daughters of Charity, the Assumption Sisters. Then also, we have the first publications, the catechisms, like the Doctrina Cristiana and Lengua Española y Tagala. So this was published in 1593. Then the Kasaysayan ng Pasyong Mahal ni Kristong Panginoon natin, and other publications. It was mentioned yesterday that there were unacknowledged contributions of the friars and the secular clergy. And these are the public infrastructure projects which were introduced by the regular and secular priests. They built roads and bridges, convents and churches, and engaged in various economic and industrial activities. Another salient feature during this period that aided evangelization was the devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and the veneration of the saints. And some of these devotions are being practiced even today. So you have here different devotions and different shrines dedicated in her honor. And so you have the Dominicans would have the Our Lady of the Rosary, the Franciscans, Nuestra Senora de Penafrancia, and so on. And you also have famous images of the Blessed Virgin, which are found in different churches. So you have one in the Dominican Church in the Intramuros in 1588, Binondo. I think the ones that are very famous are in Manaoag, 1605. Kaysasay, this is a very small statue in Kaysasay in Batangas in 1611. And of course, San Sebastian. Piat is also well known. Antipolo is also well known. And of course, Silang. The religious orders also spread the devotions to the saints, many of whom were the patron saints of the town. These devotions to the Blessed Virgin Mary and to the saints were perpetuated through the novenas and celebrated in the so-called fiestas. Some devotions and religious practices of the second wave of evangelization are still observed today. Then another agent that helped in evangelization are the convocation of the so-called synods and councils. So the Diocesan Synod of Manila in 1582, you have Cebu in 1600, and Manila 1771, Calasiao 1773. The efficacious evangelization of the Philippines during the second wave was made possible through a systematic engagement of both civil and ecclesiastical authorities. First, by consolidating settlements and putting up a central government, and by erecting dioceses, parishes, and missions, where religious orders of men and women, as well as secular priests, engaged themselves in the instruction of the local population. There were various institutions like schools, hospitals, orphanages, and charitable foundations that aided the evangelizing efforts of the missionaries. Devotions and other religious practices are also reinforce a belief system in its practical expression. Observations during the second wave. So you have the role of local interpreters, especially during the first years of the missionaries. Then the work of the catechists, which should be taken also into consideration. During this time, the conversion model in evangelization was in vogue. So after more or less 333 years, there was no real development of the local clergy, the diocesan clergy. There was no bishop. And the admittance of local candidates into the regular orders, the Dominicans, did not yet take place. Then the Roman Catholic Church carried out evangelization. Now let's talk about the third wave of evangelization between 1898 and 1965. So there is a new historical context in which there is the change in the social-political landscape in the Philippines. First is because of the Philippine Revolution. Now, the failure of the Spanish authorities to promote good governance and to introduce reforms for the welfare of the people led to unrest. And famous of that is the martyrdom of 3 priests, the Kumburza. The quest to overthrow the Spanish government took a different turn with the outbreak of the Spanish-American War. On account of the defeat of the Spanish forces in 1898, several Spanish missionaries were captured and imprisoned. Okay, so this is the famous depiction of the famous battle. These are the Americans. And because of that, there was a government established by Filipino revolutionaries and another one by the Americans. The change from Spanish to American sovereignty brought irreversible consequences in the relationship between the church and the state. The Catholic Church in the Philippines, which was closely identified with the Spanish crown, felt the impact of this episode. Under the Patronato Real, Spain provided financial assistance and protection to the Catholic Church, enabled the Catholic Church to exercise policy. The separation of the church from the state was clearly defined under American rule. The next circumstance during this period that affected evangelization was the arrival of the Protestants. It was during the American period when the Protestants from the United States began to arrive in the Philippines. This is so here is a Protestant. Here are the different Protestant congregations who arrived in the Philippines: the Presbyterians, Episcopalians, United Brethren, Congregationalists, Baptists, and so on. So what were the means by which they evangelized? They included the famous YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, dormitories, schools, and hospitals. That is why one of the complaints of the missionaries as well as the bishop was that it was made practically impossible for Catholic students to board or study in these institutions unless they promised to take part in Protestant services. Then you have the birth of the Aglipayan Church. A sense of being a Filipino church with Filipino bishops and priests appealed to a nationalistic disposition to which Filipinos should be part of. Now we have to connect this one with the Philippine Revolution. The founding of the revolutionary movement contributed to the emergence and development of a Filipino national church. So here is Aglipay. Then also the founding of other local churches, example, which was more or less discussed by the second speaker, the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas, the Iglesia Evangelica and the Iglesia ni Cristo. I have here a letter coming from Father Limbrook, who was then a missionary to Papua New Guinea, who was in the Philippines during that time. So he wrote a letter to our founder, Father Arnold Janssen, in order to convince him to send SVD missionaries to the Philippines. So here is his letter. There are many Aglipayans in the north who are trying to lure away the simple and poorly educated people, both Christians and pagans, through deception, lies, and slanders. Vying with them are Protestants who arrive in the country in ever greater numbers and who have at their disposal not only the customary lies, but also unlimited funds. Then another problem during this time, which the Roman Catholic Church felt, was the lack of priests. The exodus of the Spanish missionaries and the lack of Filipino priests to take over the abandoned parishes prompted the members of the Catholic Church hierarchy to request for missionaries from different religious congregations in Europe. Okay. So, and then you have another circumstance was the introduction of the public educational system, and it had an effect in the evangelization of the local population. A majority of the American teachers who arrived in the Philippines were Protestants. Of course, the church hierarchy is now being threatened by this. So these are the Protestant missionaries. Now here is what the Archbishop James O. Doherty, the Archbishop of Malili during that time, wrote. Perhaps the greatest menace today to the faith is the public school, which has done more real harm than all other elements combined. From the United States came great numbers of teachers, most of whom were Protestants, including many ministers and YMCA workers, eager to take advantage of this opportunity to proselytize in their unique and clever fashion. So how did the Roman Catholic Church respond under the prevailing conditions? You have the Apostolic Constitution Quem Mari Sinico in 1902. A report was submitted by Chappelle, who was sent by the Holy See to the country as apostolic delegate. in order to observe what was happening. And on the basis of the above-mentioned report, the Apostolic Constitution Quae Maris Sine Qua was written. The Apostolic Constitution contained a number of recommendations for the beleaguered church. Pope Leo XIII recommended the creation of 4 new dioceses, Lipa, Tuguegarao, Capiz, and Zamboanga. The formation of the Philippine clergy was also emphasized by the document. The document stated, and I quote, "Since it is proved by experience that the native clergy is most useful everywhere, the bishops must make it their care to increase the number of native priests in such a manner, however, as to form them thoroughly in piety and character, and to make sure that they are worthy to be entrusted with ecclesiastical charges. Then to convene synods occasionally. Seminaries for the education of the secular clergy were to be established. Mission stations were to be established in non-Christian places. Then you have the request for missionaries from the Catholic Church hierarchies. Because of the influx of the Protestant missionaries, the emergence of the National Philippine National Church, which broke away with the Catholic Church and other Christian denominations. Now the members of the church hierarchy requested missionaries from Europe. So the bishops in the Philippines requested superiors of foreign missionary congregations in Europe to take over vacant parishes. So here's the list of different congregations and societies that responded to the appeal of the bishops. Now these are of different nationalities. So some are Belgians, Germans, French, Dutch, and so on. So for instance, we have the St. Paul de Chartres in 1904, Redemptorist 1906, Benedictine Sisters of Tutsi 1906, the Mill Hill Missionaries 1906, the Skut Missionaries in 1907, the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart 1908, the Divine Word Missionaries, where I belong, 1909, the Missionary Canonesses of St. Augustine 1910, and so on. Then you have the convocation of the Provincial Council of Manila in 1907. So in 1582, this was the Diocesan Synod because it was the convocation of the bishop and his priest. But this is the Provincial Council, and this is the convocation of the Archbishop of Manila and his suffragan bishop. So it is the convocation of a metropolitan archdiocese and the suffragan dioceses. So that was in 1907. Known as the Manila Council of 1907, the Provincial Council opened the door to significant reforms and directives for the Catholic Church in the Philippines. So the dioceses, after the decrees were promulgated, the dioceses of Calbayog, Lipa, Tuguegarao, Zamboanga, and the Prefecture Apostolic of Palawan were created. Catholic schools, known as parochial schools, were established in parishes. Now this is important. So after the patronato, the Holy See is now directly in charge of the evangelization of the Philippines through the apostolic delegation. So Agius recommended a permanent apostolic delegate. In 1907, there was 1 archdiocese in the Philippines and 4 suffragan dioceses. Then you also have the convocation of the different Eucharistic congresses, one in 1929 and an International Eucharistic Congress in 1937. And according to the reports, there were more than 60 nationalities represented during the Congress. Then, of course, the famous Plenary Council of Manila in 1953. So this is the convocation of the different provincial ecclesiastical provinces. Then this will be the dawn of the new wave, which is the 4th wave, brought about by Vatican II. So this is Vatican II. Let's take a look at the Philippine Church, meaning the Roman Catholic Church before 1965 and then in 2012. In 1595, there was 1 archdiocese, Manila, and 3 suffragan dioceses, Nueva Cáceres, Nueva Segovia, and Cebu. In 1910, was the creation of the dioceses of Calbayog, Lipa, Tuguegarao, Zamboanga, and the Prefecture Apostolic of Palawan. By 1960, there were 7 archdioceses and 25 suffragan jurisdictions with a Filipino cardinal in the hierarchy. Now in 2012, there were 16 metropolitan archdioceses, 58 dioceses, 4 territorial prelatures, 7 apostolic vicariates, 1 military ordinariate with 3 cardinals, 23 archbishops, and 110 bishops in the Philippines. Observations. You have 65 years between 1900 and 1965. But during that time, you have here some observations. Evangelization was no longer identified with colonization. There you have the Filipino bishops. In fact, in 1905, we have the first Filipino bishop, Jorge Barlin. Then, of course, the role of the diocesan clergy was emphasized. Then you also have, this is interesting, the admittance of Filipinos in religious orders, which during the Spanish period was not in vogue. Also the role of religious, somehow not yet in the narrative of the history of the evangelization of the Philippines. Also the role of the laity. In fact, this will be one of the topics that will be dealt with during the Second Vatican Council. What was the spirit of this period? Especially during the 1900s, the early years of the 1900s, when the Protestants arrived, there was enmity, there was distrust. And if you read the letters and reports of some of the missionaries, they would complain about, for instance, how the Protestants are trying to, I would not want to call it steal, but to take the Catholics and then make them Protestants. So here you have, within Christianity, there is conversion from Catholicism to Protestantism. During this time, there was not much talk about ecumenism and dialogue. And there was more emphasis on the denominational church instead of the gospel. Also, quite important to take note is the coming of different nationalities, both Catholic missionaries and Protestant missionaries. I'd like to point out one thing in this during this wave. So here you have from mission church to missionary church. We were a mission church during the Spanish period, but now we have an emerging missionary church, that is Filipinos, priests, religious and lay as missionaries to foreign lands. They are now heralds of the gospel. Another, which I think is also important in the history of the evangelization of the Philippines, is the appreciation of the evangelizing efforts of other Christian churches, like the Protestants. To sum it up, evangelization during this period was a success, but not complete. Marami pong salamat and good morning to all of you. Tapos na po. Ms. Jiraya, bakit wala? Okay. Saan na si Mama? Hello? Tapos na po ako.
Thank you.
Okay, magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Isa pong malaking karangalan na maging isa sa mga tagapagsalita sa Session 10 ng Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. Ako po ang pang-apat na tagapagsalita ngayong umaga. Ang pamagat po ng aking papel ay Balatiagon, Huya, Kagkabalaslan, ang kampanya ng mga Pilipinong Baptist tungo sa pagsasarili at pagsasakapangyarihan 1922 to 1935. Kahit paano po ay nagagalak tayo na nabanggit po ni Father Layugan yung mga Baptist, nabanggit din po niya yung Union Espiritista, at kahit paano ay papalitawin din natin yung perspektibo ng mga katutubong Pilipino na may kinalaman din sa paksa ni Dr. Hernandez. Ayan po, bago po tayo magsimula, nais ko munang magbigay ng maikling konteksto dito. Nasa kaliwa po yung logo ng American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. Ito po ay originally talaga nabuo noong 1814 nung nagkaroon ng triennial convention yung mga Baptist sa Estados Unidos. Nais nating bigyang diin na talagang yung mga samahan ng Baptist na nasa Pilipinas ay originally galing po talaga yan sa US. At syempre meron pa yung mga ugat doon sa Inglaterra at sa Europa. Pero by 1814 na itatag po itong ABFMS. Pero by 1845 po ay nangyari yung parang religious schism sa pagitan ng mga Northern Baptist churches at yung mga Southern Baptist churches. Kaya nahati po sila doon sa issue ng slavery, no? So yung Southern Baptist Convention ay humiwalay at yung mga Northern Baptist churches naman ay nagbuklod, naging Northern Baptist Convention, at ngayon po ay kilala sila bilang American Baptist Churches USA or ABC USA. Sa makatwid, yung naitayo po na itong Convention of Philippine Baptist Churches, ito po ay dala-dala na, no, ng ABFMS na rooted doon sa Northern Baptist Churches. So ang logo naman po dito sa right side, nakalagay po dyan 1900 kasi ang Baptist Mission talaga, actually ang original talaga na pagkatatag ng Baptist Mission ay 1898 habang nasa Espanya pa, no, yung unang missionary nila na si Eric Lund na isang Swedish at si Braulio Manican na taga Ibahay, Aklan. So doon sila nagbuklod, pero 1900 po dumating sa Pilipinas yung dalawang two-man team na ito at pinili nila yung Western Visayas bilang kanilang lugar ng pagmimisyon bago pa yung nangyari yung Committee Agreement of 1901, kung kailan hinati ang Pilipinas sa iba't ibang misyong protestante. No, nabanggit na ni Father kanina yung yung mga dumating Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Disciples of Christ, Congregationalist, Baptist, etc. Okay, ano po ba ang ambag ng ating papel dito sa paggunita ng 500 taong anibersaryo ng Kristyanismo? Nais po nating bigyan ng diin din, no, na hindi lang po Catholic Church, no, ang dapat maitanghal, no, sa 500 taon na ito, dahil nga marami pa pong anyo ng Kristyanismo Siyempre, ang pinaka-prominent dyan, siyempre, Catholic Church, dinala ng mga Espanyol, yung mga Protestant denominations, dala ng mga Amerikano, pero siyempre, marami din mga grupo na inangkin, no? Binihisa ng anyo at itinatag din ng mga Pilipino, yung mga tinatawag natin mga homegrown churches. So ano pa, nabibigyan ng tinig, no, sa Philippine historiography ang iba't ibang anyo ng pakikibaka at pagpupunyagi ng mga Pilipinong protestante kasama na ang mga Baptist tungo sa pagsasarili at pagsasakapangyarihan bilang pakikiisa sa damdaming nasyonalismo na ang tinutukoy natin na panahon dito ay yung mga 1910, 1920 hanggang 1930s na napakalakas, no, ng pag-assert ng mga Pilipino na humiwalay hindi lamang doon sa American colonial government kasi sige-sige yung independence missions. At the same time, doon sa local level, sa aspect ng relihiyon, may mga Pilipino din na bagamat nagpa-convert sila bilang protestante, ay ina-assert pa rin nila na humiwalay at maging independent. Okay? At alam po ninyo, yung mga Baptist, alam na alam po yan ng mga Baptist scholars na kasama natin dito sa mga nag-join sa Zoom. Ang mga Baptist po ay kilala sa schism o religious schism. Mahilig humiwalay at gumawa ng sariling grupo. May mga something na hindi mapagkasunduan lang sa teolohiya o sa pamumuno o sa anyo ng pagsamba, ganyan. Hihiwalay na agad. So alam niyo na, sa mahabang kasaysayan ng mga Baptist mula pa sa Europa hanggang sa US hanggang sa Pilipinas, uso talaga yung schism. No, yung palagi na lang alam niyo na, no, na ano ba tawag nila, nag-break away o nag-divide ang simbahan, no? Pero nais kong i-emphasize dito sa papel ko na may ganun ding pagnanais yung mga Filipino Baptist sa Western Visayas, pero iba ang nangyari na humantong sa tinatawag na compromise at limited autonomy. So yan po yung CPBC. Ano po ba ang uniqueness ito? Ito po yung direct offspring, no, ng American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, no, na yun po yung pinakauna talaga na Baptist mission na dumating before the war. Kasi meron pa pong ibang mga grupo ng Baptist na dumating po after the war. Especially nung nagsara ang China because of communism. So pag alam po ninyo, pag sinabi niyo Baptist, anong klaseng grupo yan? Marami po kasing Baptist denominations. Pero yung CPBC po, ang uniqueness po na ito po talaga yung original na pinakaunang dumating before the war. At the same time, ito rin yung pinakamalaki, sinasabi mga nasa 28% ng lahat ng Baptist sa Pilipinas ay member ng CPBC. At pangatlo, ito yung open sa ecumenism o ecumenical movement na isa rin siyang active member hanggang ngayon ng tinatawag nating NCCP o National Council of Churches in the Philippines. So umaasa po ako ng aking papel ay kahit paano ay sasagot, no, or magiging kaugnay doon sa apat na halagahin ng ating konferensya na PIQC doon sa aspekto ng unity, magnanimity, freedom, and identity. Okay. Ito po kasing paksa na ito ay napakalapit sa akin kasi ito po yung aking doctoral dissertation na tinapos sa UP noong 2018. Ako rin po ay isang third generation Baptist member na taga Romblon Province. At para maging unique ang aking pag-aaral doon sa mga iba pang mga church historians ng CPBC, ako po ay gumamit ng kinatawag na indigenous psychology o kinagisnang psikolohiya, no? Aralin natin yung mga basic values and perspectives ng mga Bisaya, especially doon sa Western Visayas, no, bakit nila tinanggap ang Baptist faith, no, or ano yung mga hinahanap nila na matutugunan ng pananampalatayang ito, no? So ang ating pong central question ay bakit maituturing na resulta ng isang kompromiso ang pagkatatag ng CPBC noong 1935? No? Ito yung taon din kung kailan pinasinayaan yung Philippine Commonwealth. Halos sabay no? Nangangampanya politically ang mga Filipino national leaders, no? Sina Quezon, Osmeña, Rojas. At the same time sa local level yung mga Filipino Baptist leaders ay nangangampanya rin, no? Na umaapila sila sa Baptist mission na bigyan sila ng autonomy. Okay? 1935 po yun. At para masagot po yan, meron tayong tatlo pang sekundaryang tanong. Una, ano-ano ang tatlong larangan ng psikolohiya na pakikipag-ugnayang panlipunan ng mga Pilipinong Bisaya? Yun po yung tatlo, Balatyagon, Huya at Kabalaslan. Pangalawa, ano-ano mga salik at pangyayari ang matutukoy na patunay ng paternalismo at diskriminasyon ng mga misyonerong Amerikano sa mga Pilipinong Baptist? Kasi nangyari po talaga yan, no? Hindi lang sa mga Baptist, pati sa iba pang mga Protestant churches, kaya nagkaroon ng mga schism. Okay? Pangatlo, ano-anong hakbang ang isinagawa ng mga Pilipinong Baptist upang magbigay daan sa pagtatamo ng limitadong otonomiya. So ito po yung pamagat ng aking dissertation, si PIQC, isang kasaysayang institusyonal, 1935 to 1980. At ang aking pong batayang konsepto at konseptual na balangkas ay batay na rin, no, sa pagpapayo sa akin ni Dr. Vicente Civilian nung ako po ay nagdidisertasyon. So ang definition po natin sa indigenous psychology ay maaari siyang gamitin, no, na batayang konsepto dahil ito ay nagbibigay saysay doon sa mga kapwa-aktibo at pasibong aksyon ng mga Pilipinong Bisaya sa iba't ibang yugtong pakasaysayan. Kasi po mapapansin natin, no, next slide muna tayo. Okay, ito po ay ginamit originally ni Dr. Villan, no, sa kanyang isang pag-aaral na nung panahon ng Espanyol, bakit ang mga Ilonggo o yung mga Bisaya sa Western Visayas, bakit sila yung pinakahuling tumalikod sa mga Espanyol? Kung babalikan natin ang kasaysayan, ang Iloilo ay idineklara bilang noblest city, no? Parang Lamoy Leal e noble ciudad, no? Binigyan ni Reina Cristina II ng malaking karangalan ng Iloilo City noong mga 1897 kasi nung sumiklab ang revolusyon sa Katagalugan, iba ang reaksyon ng mga Ilonggo, no? Sila ay nagalit sa mga Tagalog. Ang tawag nila sa himagsikan ay pag-aalsang Tagalog lang kasi iba ang naging karanasan ng mga Ilonggo o ng mga Bisaya doon sa karanasan ng mga Tagalog kasi yumaman, no, because of the opening of Iloilo to international trade, no, nagkaroon ng international port 1855 and then nag-boom na in-encourage yung sugar industry. Yumaman sa industriya ng asukal ang mga Ilonggo, yung mga elite especially. So, ang reaction nila, bakit kayo magre-revolusyon? Pinayaman kami. Iba ang karanasan nila sa mga Tagalog. To the point na nung nag-revolusyon, nagpadala pa ng tinatawag na Ilonggo Volunteer Battalion. 500 soldiers ito ng mga Ilonggo natives na pumunta sa Luzon para tulungan ang Spanish colonial government laban sa mga katipunero at revolusyonaryo. So, ang paliwanag dito ni Dr. Villan ay because of the indigenous psychology, no, gumamit siya ng mga indigenous concepts gaya ng ilob, punong amok, na unang-una talaga, kaya naging very loyal ang mga Bisaya o yung mga Ilonggo particularly, ay nagkaroon kasi ng sanduguan. Isa siyang ritual na sagrado sa mga Bisaya, no? Isa siyang pre-colonial ritual na kapag isinagawa mo yung sanduguan o pacto de sangre, no, or blood compact, di ba? Para mo na rin ituturing na kapatid or manghod, younger brother o sister, yung sino man na nakipagsandugo ka, ituturing mo na siyang kapatid, no? Hindi mo man siya biologically kamag-anak, pero because of that ritual, no, tinatawag siyang fictive kinship, inimbentong pagkamag-anakan. Kung kaya, panahon pa lang ni Legazpi, panahon pa lang, sina si Katuna, no, sina Raha Madidong, at yung iba pang mga raha sa Visayas, nakipagsandugo sila as early as 1565, 1569, no? Kasi nga meron din silang common enemy, yung mga Moro o yung mga, alam nyo na, yung mga Muslim galing sa Mindanao. At that time ay nasa Manila na yung Islamization. So meron common enemy ang mga Bisaya at ang Spanish forces, kaya isa rin malaking factor yon na nag-unite ang mga Bisaya at ang mga Espanyol. So itong konsepto ng ilob, no, pagpapakumbaba at pagpaparaya at saka unong pagiging matapat, naging loyal talaga, no, ang mga Ilonggo sa mga Espanyol, no? That was 1565 pa because of the sanduguan. And then eventually, noong 19th century, gumanti rin ang mga Espanyol ng kabutihang loob, no? Pinayaman nila ang mga Ilonggo. Gaya ng sinabi ko kanina, binuksan ang Iloilo sa international trade at nag-boom ang sugar industry, no? Yumaman yung mga Ilonggong elite. But eventually, no, nung mga latter part na, kahit sabihin nating last, no, parang naging last capital ng Espanyol ang Iloilo eh. Pero nung huli, sumama na rin yung mga Ilonggo later on sa revolusyon. Bagamat nahuli sila, nangyari na yung tinatawag na amok, pagbulalas ng kinuyom na galit, especially yung mga ordinaryong Bisaya na nasa Aklan, Capiz, Antique na mas maaga yung pagtatayo nila ng mga chapter ng Katipunan. Mas maaga sila ang Ilonggo ang medyo huli at yung mga Negrense. Okay, ito yung konteksto ng Western Visayas nang dumating ang mga Amerikano. Okay, so naninindigan po tayo no, na ang kinudis ng psikolohiya, no? Gagamit ka ng isang bagong methodology, paano mo mauunawain yung passive at active actions or response ng mga Bisaya doon sa Spanish colonial period. Yun ang kay Dr. Villan, yung akin ay bakit nakipaglaban at later on pumayag ang mga Baptist na magkaroon ng compromise na lang sa mga Amerikano at naitayo nga yung CPBC 1935. Okay? So, maano lang natin, no, maipakita lang natin yung picture ng Western Visayas na binubuo ng ilang probinsya gaya ng Aklan, Capiz, Antique, Iloilo, Guimaras, Negros Occidental. So, yan po talaga yung pinili no, ng Baptist Mission na maging lugar ng kanilang pagmimisyon prior to 1900. Kasi unang-una, si Manikan, yung partner ni Lund ay taga-Ibahay Aklan. Pangalawa, dahil ang Iloilo po yung tinuturing na Queen City of the South, no, nag-boom talaga yung economy ng Iloilo because of sugar. Yung mama ng mga tao, nagkaroon ng mga infrastructures, ng mga changes sa transportation and communication, etc. So, isa rin sa target ng mga American Baptist missionaries, yung Iloilo kasi ang second richest city after Manila. Ito yung original na tinatawag noon na Queen City of the South. Ngayon kasi Cebu na. No? Kasi nasira ang Iloilo especially noong World War II. Pero noong 1900, Iloilo talaga ang number 2. Okay, next slide. Okay, balikan lang natin na mabilis yung kasaysayan ng Mission Baptist. So 1900 po, no, dumating sina Eric Lund at Braulio Manikan, galing sila sa Spain. Si Manikan po na yan, gaya ng nasabi natin, ay taga-Ibahay Aklan, nag-aral sa seminaryo sa Haro, pero later on, pumunta ng Spain, no, medyo elite naman siya, nakapag-aral ng engineering sa isang universidad sa Espanya at doon niya na-encounter si Lund na isang Swedish missionary. And then later on, sila ay kinausap at pinondohan ng American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. So dumating sila sa Pilipinas 1900. Okay, 1905 no, naitayo yung pinakaunang parang provincial association ng mga Baptist na nangyari ito sa Iloilo, yung tinatawag na Iloilo Kasapulanan. Yung word na Kasapulanan sa Hiligaynon language galing sa word na sapul, ibig sabihin ay to associate or to assemble. So nagkaroon ng parang provincial chapter yung mga Baptist. Ang pinakauna po dyan ay Iloilo, 1905. So somehow nagsisimula na dito yung nag-assemble na or nag-organize na, nagbubuklod na yung mga Pilipinong Baptist. And then after 20 years, nangyari yung isang malaki na namang religious schism sa Pilipinas. No, nagkaroon ng merong isang missionary, si Dr. Rafael C. Thomas. Isa siyang medical doctor talaga. Pero meron siyang something, nung panahon kasi na yun, merong away yung tinatawag na fundamentalist at modernist controversy. No, na para bang ano po tayo, may kinalaman po ito sa tinatawag na social gospel at saka pure gospel. Pag social gospel kasi, nakafocus ka sa tatlong ministries, no? Preaching, teaching, healing. Nagpapatayo ka ng school, nagpapatayo ka ng paaralan, ng hospital, at saka ng mga churches. Pero ang gusto ni Thomas, fundamental siya, ang gusto niya, dapat, talaga, pure evangelism lang, magtutok lang talaga sa actual evangelism, wag na mag-hospital, wag na mag-school. So nagkaroon ng problema yan sa Amerika, no? Doon ni-resolve ang problema, pero hindi na-resolve. So si Thomas, meron siyang tagapondo sa kanya, nagtayo ng hiwalay na samahan. Ito na yung Association of Baptists for Evangelism in the Orient, and eventually tinatawag din po itong mga Fundamental Baptist. So, pero at the same time, yung mga Filipino Baptist, yung may mga churches doon na loyal pa rin sa ABFMS. No? Naging loyal sila kasi syempre, 'di ba, nakinabang sila sa ospital at paaralan eh. So, merong umalis, merong nagstay. Pero mapangwasak itong schism na ito noong 1925. And then 1926, no, dahil gusto talaga ng mga Filipino na i-assert ang kanilang autonomy, ay naitayo yung tinatawag na General Board ng Visayan Evangelical Convention. Pero yung mga American missionaries, ayaw nilang i-give up agad-agad yung kanilang presence and power sa Pilipinas. So nagkaroon ng isang joint committee, no, kung saan merong executive committee na binubuo ng mga American missionaries at saka meron ding reference committee na binubuo naman ng mga Filipino leaders. So parang compromise, no? Dahan-dahan, gradual yung pag-Philippinize, no? Pero hindi talaga rin mapahupa yung mga Filipino Baptist. Okay, 1927, so naghain ng 7 resolusyon ang mga Pilipinong leader para i-Philippinize ang Mission Baptist to the point na para bang gusto nilang paalisin yung mga missionaries. Kasi kaya na namin eh. No? Highly educated na yung mga leaders namin. No? Pero siyempre, ayaw yan ng mga American missionaries. And then 1929, ito pala yung binabanggit ko kanina, sorry, yung Western Visayan Convention, 1929 na pula yun. Later pa. And then, after iba pang mga serye ng negosasyon na itatag na nga yung Kasapulanan sang Bautista nga Pilipinhon o CPBC 1935. Okay? So ito po yung larawan ni Dr. Eric Lund sa left side at saka si Pastor Braulio Manican sa right side. Okay, balikan lang natin. No? Ayon dun sa CPBC 1935 bylaws, ito yung mga halimbawa ng mga katuruan o prinsipyo na pinanghahawakan ng mga Baptist. Mapapansin po ninyo na karamihan dito ay influence din ng Luther's Reformation at pinanghahawakan din ng iba pa mga Protestant churches, no, gaya ng una, pangalawa, pangatlo. Pero yung pang-4, pang-5, pang-6, medyo unique po ito sa mga Baptist. Talagang ina-assert nila yung konsepto ng local autonomy na hindi siya basta-basta pwede diktahan ng anumang convention o higher authority. Dapat ang hanggat maaari ang masusunod yung local autonomy ng mga local churches. At the same time, no, mahabang tradisyon din na kiniklaim ng mga Baptist na sila ang may malaking kinalaman doon sa pagtataguyod ng tinatawag nating separation of church and state at saka yung religious liberty o kalayaan sa pagsamba. Okay, basahin ko lang po itong isang quote na ito ni Dr. Linnea Nelson. Sabi niya, quote, "Historians give Baptists a large share of the credit for the spread of the idea of religious liberty. The union of church and state is contrary to the word of God, contrary to natural justice, and destructive to both parties to the union. Baptists have fought for the separation of church and state. The principle has now become a fundamental principle of law, and no true lover of liberty and democracy, no matter what his religion, will not deny it. In fact, most persons today do not know who were the original propagators and defenders of the true relation of church and state. No student of history can fail to note that Baptists have been pioneers in holding and defending the principle of the right relationship of church and state, which culminates in the ideal a free church in a free state." Unquote. No? So talagang meron kasing mahabang kasaysayan ng mga Baptist na pinipersecute sila, no, ng hari o ng simbahang Katoliko, kaya palagi silang naghahanap ng bagong lugar na maging kolonya halimbawa kung saan malaya sila makapag-practice ng kanilang pananampalataya. So balikan na po natin o puntahan na po natin yung tatlong larangan naman ng psikolohiya. Paano natin uunawain yung konteksto ng 20th century, first half ng 20th century ng mga Baptist sa Pilipinas. So ito na nga po yung nasa title natin, Balatyagon, Huya, Kabalaslan. Yung balatyagon, ibig sabihin po ay pakiramdam, no? Empathy. No? Nararamdaman ng mga Pilipinong Baptist na malakas ang daluyong ng nasyonalismo noong 1910, 1920, 1930. So, at the same time, grabe rin yung oppression ng mga Filipino Visayans na nasa sakada ng mga tubuhan sa Negros. No? Yung mayaman yung ulit, pero grabe yung suffering ng mga ordinary workers doon sa mga plantasyon. So, nararamdaman, no, na nagabatsyag, no, nakikiramdam yung mga Filipino Baptist doon sa injustices na yon. At the same time, meron din kabalaslan. Ibig sabihin ng kabalaslan from the word balos, ibig sabihin ay gaganti. At ang ibig sabihin talaga nito ay utang na loob. Kasi meron din silang utang na loob sa mga misyonero. No? Nakikisimpatya ka doon sa mga ino-oppress. At the same time, may utang na loob ka sa mga misyonero. Kaya mixed feelings, no, ang meron sa mga Baptist. To the point na nagbigay daan na nga lang doon sa tinatawag na huya or hiya na para bang pumayag ka na lang na medyo wag nang maglunsad ng isang radical na schism, kundi compromise. No? Parang parang win-win na lang. No? So nangyari nga po yung pagkatayo ng CPBC 1935. Okay? I-quote natin si Dr. Samuel Caytan. Sabi niya, quote, A study of the period from 1921 to 1930 offers a very good insight into the many phases of the struggle for independence against colonial and feudal interests, which gave the decade both a unique character and significance. No doubt, the decade witnessed the birth of movements, conflicts, and struggles that tended to bring polarizations of society into conservatives and radicals, as well as the intense confrontation between socialist and capitalist ideologies. Samantala, ikaw din natin si Professor Chodoro Agoncillo na dinescribe din niya, no, kung ano yung nangyayari nung panahon na yon. Sabi niya, quote, "In fact, peasant and labor unrest had manifested themselves in a new upsurge in the 20s in the face of grinding poverty, high taxes, usury, oppressive treatment by caciques, land grabbing, fraudulent titling, and other legal tricks employed by the rich and the powerful. Movements led by self-styled messiahs, secret societies in the revolutionary tradition, and old organizations such as the Pulahanes and Colorums erupted not only in Luzon but also in the Visayas and in Mindanao. Such were the Colorums of Surigao in 1923, Francisco Entrencherado in the Visayas in 1927, and the Colorums in Tayug, Pangasinan in 1931. While for the most part, American officials and Filipino politicians contemptuously dismissed them as fanatical movements or plain banditry. These movements reflected peasant grievances and aspirations. So somehow po nakarelate, no, yung mga Filipino Baptist dun sa suffering, hindi lang sa Negros, pati sa Pangasinan, Surigao, and other parts of the archipelago. Okay, at kapansin po na itong panahon na ito, especially sa dekada Gs at dekada 20, napakaraming mga religious schisms na nangyari na within the Protestant denominations and missions. At ang very famous dito yung dalawa, no, yung Amy Leaf o yung tinatawag natin na Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in las Islas Filipinas, 1909, itinayo ni Nicolas Zamora, na actually siya ay parang grand nephew ni Father Jacinto Zamora ng Gumbursa. No, na naging protestante sila ng kanyang ama, naging pastor siya ng isang Methodist mission, pero because of discrimination, no, maliit ang sweldo, mababa ang pagtingin sa kanya, later on nag-lead ito sa paghihiwalay at pagtatayo ng bagong denominasyon. Ito nga yung Amy Leaf, 1909, na member din naman ngayon ng NCCP. And then syempre, ang isa pang significant dyan, na very influential hanggang ngayon, ay yung Church of Christ o Iglesia ni Cristo na itinayo ni Felix Manalo y Isago 1914, na alam naman natin na batay sa kanilang kasaysayan, ang kanilang founder ay naging convert o naging pastor o preacher din naman at na-impluensyahan din naman ng iba't ibang denominasyong protestante gaya ng yung Christian Missionary Alliance yata, no, na naging Adventist din siya. So may mga ganon, no, na influence sa INC. Okay, so gaya ng sabi natin, yung Balatyagon, pakiramdam, nakikisimpatya ang mga Filipino Baptist sa nangyayari sa Pilipinas nung panahon na yon. Shared inner perception, feeling for another, sensing cues. Ito yung patunay, no? I-quote natin si Restituto Ortigas, 1954. Sabi niya, quote, "During those days of political pugilism, our religious leaders also thought of independence from missions. And because this was a healthy idea, the different mission boards in US considered the matter of turning the administration fully into the hands of the nationals, but with it went the responsibility and program of self-support. In this connection, the elusive term Filipinization arose in connection with our religious programs and goals. If you ask me to define Filipinization in our convention work, I am sorry to say that I cannot do it, for we still are not agreed on the term." So sila mismo, hindi nila masyadong, hindi sila magkasundo ano talaga ang meaning ng Filipinization. Pero sila ay influenced and inspired sa mga nangyayari sa iba't ibang bahagi ng bansa nung panahon na yon. Okay, ito yung ilan sa mga issue ng mga Filipino Baptist laban sa mga American missionaries. Halimbawa, yung konsepto ng paternalism. Yung para bang naniniwala ang mga Amerikano na kailangan nila maging tatay o maging magulang sa mga Pilipino sa maraming aspects ng relihiyon at kahit siguro politika o lipunan, na kailangan nyo kami. no? At halimbawa, ito yung mga ilan sa mga issue. Halimbawa, nung nangyari yung Great Depression 1929, bumagsak ang ekonomiya ng Amerika, itong Baptist Mission, without consulting the local churches, nagbenta ng mga ari-arian. Siyempre, bumagsak ang ekonomiya, kinulang sa pera yung Baptist Mission. Yung mga American missionaries nag-decide na magbenta ng ari-arian doon kasi ang kanilang mga himpilan kasi ay tatlo Kapis-Kapis na ngayon ay Rojas City, Iloilo City at saka Bacolod. So meron doon mga dormitoryo, meron doon mga ospital, meron doon mga student centers. Ang iba doon binenta para magkaroon ng pera. Pero nagalit yung ibang mga Filipino Baptist, bakit hindi mo na nag-consult? No? So may mga na-offend. And then halimbawa, yung College of Theology sa Central Philippine College, ngayon ay Central Philippine University na, meron din criticism na bakit ang tagal ninyo magtayo ng College of Theology para sana mas equipped, no, mas ready ang mga Pilipino na pangunahan or assume ng higher responsibility sana. Pero nung una kasi puro na lang mga institute or mga 3 months lang or 6 months lang na training sa mga pastor for preaching, wala pa talagang College of Theology. Ang tagal pa bago na itayo. I think mga 1927 ito. So isa rin sa mga issue yan. Next po ay yung diskriminasyon. Halimbawa, mas malaki ang sahod ng American missionary kaysa sa Pilipinong pastor o mga ngaral. Makikita po natin ang difference yan, mga twice or thrice ang difference. So, yan din ang reason. Halimbawa, si Braulio Manican, na kasama ni Lon, later on po, yan po ay tumalikod. 1906. No? Kasi ang nangyari yata ay nahuli siya na nagsusugal. Tapos, nirebuke siya ng American missionary. Pero ang reason pala, kaya siya nagsusugal, ay maliit ang kanyang sahod na natatanggap. Tapos malaki ang kanyang pamilya sa Ibahay, Aklan. No, hindi naman natin ginijustify pero may reason bakit ginawa ni Braulio Manican yung magsugal. Kasi nga, maliit ang sweldo. And then, marami din mga Filipino professionals na kapag-aral pa nga sa Amerika, no, pero mababa pa rin ang tingin sa mga Pilipino. At ang best example nga dyan, yung first president mismo ng CPBC na si Dr. Feliciano Sumbito, taga Bacolod, siya ay fresh graduate ng medicine sa University of Illinois. Umuwi siya sa Pilipinas 1915 para i-offer ang kanyang services sa convention. Hindi pa convention, Baptist Mission. Pero ang ginawa sa kanya ng mga missionary, pinaupo siya doon sa plaza ng Bacolod, pinainitan, pinahintay ng matagal, no? And then hindi rin siya kinuha. So hindi nakakapagtaka na nagtanim ng galit itong si Dr. Sombito laban sa mga American missionaries because of discrimination. And of course, meron din criticism ang mga Filipino Baptist doon sa mga missionaries. Halimbawa, merong isang missionary na mahilig daw sumakay ng first class ticket sa barko. No? So para bang napakagastos naman itong missionary na to. So may mga ganong criticism. And then meron din isang missionary na member siya ng Bible Translation Committee, no? Pero ironically, hindi siya marunong ng wikang Hiligaynon. Napansin ito ng mga Filipino Baptist na ano ba naman yan, magta-translate ka, wala ka palang alam sa wikang Hiligaynon. Ibig sabihin, hindi mo inaral ang wika. No? So kapansin-pansin po yan o nirereklamo po yan ng mga Filipino Baptist. Okay, ang next naman po ay utang na loob o kabalaslan. Appreciation of kapwa, solidarity, will, state of mind, volition, disposition. So, meron kang parang galit or tampo sa mga missionary, but at the same time, hindi rin naman nakakalimot, no, ang mga Pilipino na nakinabang sila doon sa mga ipinatayong schools, churches, and hospitals. Ito po yung direct quotation kay Francisco Baha. Tingnan po ninyo yung word ito na kabalaslan. No? Dili matakos ang mga kabalaslan ko sini sa ila. No? Pero ito po yung translation natin. Gamitin na lang po natin yung translation. Sahin ko po, quote, "Hindi ko masukat ang aking utang na loob ngayon sa kanila. May malalaking puso at matulungin. Marami kaming mga kabataan noon na manghihirap na libreng nag-aaral dahil sa karukhaan. Magigiliw sila at talagang nagtagal sa kanilang banal na misyon at may mga pusong punong-puno ng pag-ibig bilang Kristiyano. Kung kaya sa aking bahagi ay ang pag-alaala ko noon sa mga Amerikano, mga kaibigan at tagapagkaloob at talagang hindi magmamaliw sa aking buong buhay." So meron din tinatanong, mahalaga din sa mga Bisaya yung pagbahalos. No? Kung ginawang ka ng kabutihan, dapat balikan mo rin o gantihan mo rin ng kabutihan. So ito po yung picture sa taas, ito po yung noon pa, no, na Emmanuel Hospital or also known ngayon na Capiz Emmanuel Hospital sa Rojas City. At yung picture naman sa baba, yan yung unang picture ng Union Hospital sa Iloilo City na parehong pinangasiwaan ng Baptist at Presbyterian. nung first decade. Okay, ang ano ko po dito, ang interpretation po natin dito, nag-result sa compromise, nangyari yung huya or hiya. So, pumagitna, no? May balatsagon ka, meron kang kabalaslan sa isang side, no? Pero papagitna yan, so mahihiya ka na lang doon sa both parties. So, pumayag na parang compromise ang mangyayari. So, ibig sabihin ng hiya, shame, a painful feeling of having done something wrong, improper or silly or disgrace. Okay. So halimbawa po, basahin natin yung isang letter ng isang missionary, 1916 po ito, na grabe yung away ng mga missionary at ng mga Pilipino. Quote, "The last conference was the longest and hardest and worst that I have attended in the PI of Philippine Islands. This spirit of antagonism and mutual distrust and suspicion, made the conference anything but helpful and inspirational. When the conference closed, I felt more discouraged over the condition of affairs that I have ever felt before." So ito po ay 1916. No, pero tingnan natin ang nangyari after 20 years. Kung kailan na itayo na yung CPBC, no? Sabi niya, the same person, Reverend Munger, sabi niya, quote, a good spirit prevails among our leaders. While differences of opinions are frankly and freely expressed, they do not disturb the spirit of the meeting nor produce harmony. And I have frequently noticed a disposition among them where differences of view appear to find a compromise. Ito po yung word na dapat i-highlight. To find a compromise wherever and whenever possible. There seems to be no disposition to run roughshod over the opinions of the minority or to force a matter through by majority votes. This, it seems to me, is very commendable. Okay, nandito po tayo sa konklusyon. So gamit ang lente ng kinagisnang psikolohiya na ipakita ng papel na ito ang kasaysayan ng pakikibaka ng mga Pilipinong Baptist tungo sa pagsasarili at pagsasakapangyarihan. Kung kailan, masinsinan din ang kampanya ng mga Pilipinong leader pampolitika na igiit ang paglaya mula sa mga Amerikano. So somehow nakisabay. No, may political independence, meron din parang independence sa aspect ng relihiyon. So hindi hiwalay. Nakikisabay din, no, yung local sa national. And of course, sumibol sa kanila yung tatlong halagahin na binanggit natin. No, yung balatyagon o pakiramdam bilang pakikiisa sa rumanagasang daluyong ng damdaming Pilipino ng mga damdaming nasyonalismo ng mga Pilipino sa pangkalahatan. Hindi nila maitatanggi ang kanilang nag-uumapaw na kabalasnan o utang na loob sa mga misyonaryong Amerikano. Nagpamalas din naman ng kagandahang loob at sakripisyo upang pagtamasa sila ng ginhawa sa kanilang mga buhay sa nakaraang 2 dekada. Kung kaya, nagresulta ito sa tinatawag natin na hiya or huya. And finally, batid ang katotohanan ng hindi nila maaaring talikuran ng alinman sa dalawang panig, kung kaya mapayapa silang nakipagkompromiso sa mga dayuhan. Sa halip na maglunsad ng radikal na iskismong panrelihiyon, yung parang tatalikod pa sila at gumawa ng hiwalay na denominasyon, mas pinili nila ang pagtatamasa ng limitadong otonomiya. At ito na nga po yung pagkatatag ng CPBC noong 1935. Maraming salamat po sa inyong panonood at pakikinig. Magandang umaga.
Very much, Professor Esquejo. As someone who grew up in a Southern Baptist church myself, it was wonderful to learn about how there's a rich tradition of nationalism and Philippine independence that goes along with the development of our Protestant type churches. So we're going to jump right into questions here. So our participants have full control of the next couple of minutes of our session today. So I see a lot of really good comments in our chat box here, many expressions of thanks for Dr. Esquejo. So if you have questions, please drop them in our Q&A session. So I'd like to invite our speakers who are present today to come back on screen. If you can, turn on your camera, but if you can't, it's okay. Just wait for the questions which may be addressed to you. So ayan po, do we have any questions filtering into our Q&A box? I'm going to begin with the ones that I've collected so far. We have two in the roster. Hold on. Okay. So here's the first one. Ay, wait lang, skip siya. Wait lang po. If we have more questions, especially from the people here who are saying thank you, we're going to extend to about 12:20. But if not, we're going to try to answer the present questions in the next 10 minutes. Give me a moment lang po. Nawalan kasi ng kuryente dito kanina, so I just need to pull up my notes from the earlier session. All right. So here's a question po from Dr. Nella Ferrendo, and it is addressed to Father Layugan and Dr. Esquejo. Here's the question. Was there some tacit agreement on religious geography for each of the denominations? So I guess this is a question about how the Philippines was, I guess, organized and how they came to those agreements on our religious geography. Who would like to begin?
Well, concerning the different congregations like the CICMs, SVDs, the Mill Hill Missionaries, usually these were the ones who were invited by bishops. So for instance, for the SVDs, their geographical area was in Abra. And then the CICMs, the mountain provinces, Mill Hill would be in the Visayas, like Surigao, and so on. So there was.
Bilang dagdag po kay Father, nabanggit ko na po kanina yung Committee Agreement of 1901. Bago pa yung Committee Agreement, actually yung mga Baptist gusto nila sa Western Visayas agad kasi yung Iloilo nga ay Queen City of the South. And at the same time, si Manikan nga ay taga-Aklan, marunong ng wikang Hiligay noon, nag-translate ng mga biblical literature, alam niyo na, potential. And at the same time, nung panahon po na yon na 1900, ay parang mas nag-focus na yung Philippine-American War doon sa Luzon Wala na masyado sa Visayas, kaya parang medyo pacified ang kanilang term. So, 1901 po, nag-convene yung mga iba't ibang Protestant denominations and then pinaghatian nila. So halimbawa, hindi nakakapagtaka bakit halimbawa yung Episcopalian ay malakas sa Cordillera kasi yan ang pinili nila. No? And then halimbawa yung mga Methodist na sa bandang Central Luzon, no? Yung mga Presbyterian, yung Silliman University sa Dumaguete, Central Visayas sila and Eastern Visayas. And then yung Congregationalist at saka yung Christian Missionary Alliance sa bandang sa bandang Mindanao. Pero yung Manila po ay open sa lahat ng denomination. So yun ang kanilang kasunduan.
Thank you very much for your answers. Here's a comment from earlier po, and then we'll follow it up with 2 questions. So there was a comment on Prof. Esquejo's presentation from John Arseno. The vague definition of or failure to define Filipinization also happened to the Southern Baptists in the Philippines. Would you like to comment po or should we proceed to the questions? To the other questions?
Just comment briefly. Salamat Pastor JP sa pag-attend sa comment kasi connected yung aming study Yung akin kasi focus dun sa Northern Baptist na naging CPBC sa Pilipinas. Tapos yung kanila naman po na Southern Baptist. Pati yata yung sa'yo, Ma'am Gray, no? Southern Baptist, dumating po yun kasi after the war na 1948. Salamat po.
Here's a follow-up question. Sorry. We're going to go by, for our participants here today, we're going to go by when the questions are submitted as opposed to which questions are connected kasi they're kind of coming in at the same time. So here's a question from Jan Joseph Rivera. Para po kay Dr. Esquejo, nang magkaroon po ng malawakang imigrasyon ng mga Ilonggo noong 1913 papuntang Hilagang Mindanao, alam po natin na madami din ang sumamang Baptist. Bakit po sa kasalukuyan mas marami ang UCCP at Metodista sa lugar na gayong sa pagkakaalam ko, mas marami po ang misyonaryong Baptist sa kanila. Bakit nanatili pa rin po tayo sa mga salin na hiligay noon mula noong 1990 habang ang iba ay may malawak ng mga salin ng Biblia? Do you have an answer to this, Doc?
Opo, yung migration po ng mga Ilonggo talaga, malaking problema po yan, especially 1950s after the war, kung kailan uso yung migration sa Mindanao, and at the same time, hindi na sinusunod yung committee agreement. Kasi dumating po yung ibang mga Baptist denomination, gaya ng Southern Baptist, General Baptist, Conference Baptist, Bible Baptist, ang dami pong grupo na dumating from America and China, hindi na sinusunod at nagsentro po sila either Baguio or Davao. So, nung napuntahan doon yung mga migrants from yung mga Convention Baptist talaga, yung CPBC, marami po sa kanila talaga ay na-convert or napunta sa ibang churches na Baptist din naman pero ano na. At the same time, yung UCCP po kasi natayo ang UCCP 1948. Yan po ay organic union ng tatlong denominasyon. Disciples of Christ, United Brethren at saka Presbyterian. So, alam niyo na, joint forces sila, malakas ang UCCP nung panahon na yan. So, hindi po nakakapagtaka na sa Mindanao, medyo, yung term siguro na hanap ni Father Mike kanina ay yung proselytize na yung parang inaagaw ng ibang denominasyon. Nangyari rin po yan sa Mindanao, even among the Protestants. Pero, hindi naman masyado nagka-problema niyan kasi hanggang ngayon, may mga Convention Baptist pa rin sa Mindanao. And at the same time, maganda ang relasyon ngayon ng CPBC at saka ng UCCP, under NCCP. Yung Saling Hiligaynon hindi ako masyadong familiar, pero nagkaroon po ng series of translation yung Hiligaynon Bible. Nung una si Dr. Eric Lund, meron siyang ginawang First Bible, 1912. Pero later on, before the war, merong translation committee, yung binabanggit ko kanina, yung isang misyonero na hindi marunong Hiligaynon, ay nag-start na sila mag-revise ng Bible. And then ang isa sa pinaka-recent in line with Father Mike, yung nagkaroon ng malakas na yung ecumenical movement ng Catholic at Protestant, mga 1969, nagkaroon ulit ng another translation or revision ng Bible na parehong nagtulungan ang Protestante at Catholic. Salamat po.
Thank you po, sir. So for our participants here who have questions related to our first two speakers, well, except for Dr. Lada Cruz, of course. Could you please drop your questions again? Kasi medyo nawala ako sa chat kanina. So we're gonna go with the questions na more recently nag-arrive. Okay, so there's a question here from an anonymous attendee, and it reads, aside from the hermeneutical approach, what are the other causes of schism among the Baptist churches? I guess there are a lot of people from the Baptist tradition today, so I know they're quite interested in looking at their history, probably because it's not something we typically get to tackle in our educations. Would anyone like to answer that?
Ako na lang po ba? Nakakahiya po, marami pong tanong tungkol sa akin.
Okay, hanap ako ng ibang questions din.
Marami pong study na bakit nagkaroon ng mga schism. Unang-una dyan yung usapin ng theology talaga di ba? Parang anong klaseng baptism nga gamitin, di ba? Issue yan, infant baptism, water baptism, sprinkling, di ba? Isang issue yan. Pati yung pag-translate ng word na baptizo in Spanish, pinag-awayan pa yan kung ano ang gagamitin sa Hiligaynon Bible, kung pagtugmaw or kung sprinkling, water, ano lang, parang sprinkling lang. So, mainly, doctrinal or theological talaga ang away. Of course, meron ding issue ng nationalism din na-offend or alam niyo na parang nagtampo yung mga Filipino leaders so humiwalay. May ganun din pong issue. Pero based sa kasaysayong binanggit ko po kanina kay Dr. Rafael Thomas, problema, theological and social problem kasi yun sa Amerika, yung pure gospel versus social gospel na unfortunately dinala sa Pilipinas yung away. Kaya nagkaroon ng mga fundamental at saka convention later on. So, batay po sa karanasan sa Pilipinas, wala masyado sa mga personality-based loyalty. Ang alam ko po talaga more on doctrinal or social issue. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, Professor Espejo. Here's a question for Dr. Hernandez. And this is from an anonymous member from the LHCN. Ito po ang tanong. Maaari po ba natin ihambing ang diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol at ang indigenous na salin or pansarili ng Kristyanismo ng mga Pilipino noong panahon ng Espanyol? Di po kaya ay mas na prosesong diskurso mula sa diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol ang iba't ibang millenarian movement na lumago noong 18th and 19th centuries? Would you like to answer po, Dr. Hernandez? Ay, sir, naka-mute po kayo?
Parang nasa po ba yun? Parang hindi ko makuha yung gusto niyang sabihin eh. Parang, sorry lang. Sorry.
Okay lang po. Let's try to look at the question. I think...
Nandito ba sa chat, sa question and answers ito?
Dito po siya sa chat, sir.
Okay.
Ay, chat ko po siya ulit. Para kita po ng lahat.
Kursong sa
Ito po siya. I just chatted it sa ating nababasa.
Ito, nakita ko na. Thank you.
Pasensya na po. Thank you, sir.
Maaari po ba natin ihambing ang diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol at ang indigenous na saling o pagsasarili ng Kristyanismo ng mga Pilipino noong panahon ng Espanyol? Yung punto ko kasi, sino ba ito? Basta. Ang punto ko kasi dito ay yung diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol, yung nagmumula yun sa sinabi ko na conquista, reconquista at yung kanilang pagkakaunawa sa Kristyanismo ay actually isa lamang na bunsod, isa lamang na tulak para sa ganon ay higit na mailabas ng mga ninuno natin yung kanilang saloobin o yung kanilang kaisipan tungkol sa kanilang sinaunang pananampalataya. So kung punto ko is that kung dumating man yung Kristyanismo, yun lang yun, Kristyanismo. At of course may brand ng Kristyanismo na dumating at yun nga yung galing sa Espanya o mga Espanyol. At yung mga Pilipino ay inangkin yan in a sense na sila yung kumilos para maiyangkop yung kaisipan na kanilang dinala ng mga Espanyol dito para sa ganon ay magawa nila para sila ay makakilos at maiyayin nila doon sa kanilang sariling mga ipinaglalaban o yung sa kanilang sariling kaayusan bilang mga Pilipino. So, di kaya ay mas na prosesong diskurso mula sa diskursong iba't ibang millenarian movement na lumago noong 18 at 19 na taon. Hindi rin po kasi yung ibang mga millenarian movements ay actually pinapasukan lang ng iba't ibang mga elemento na Kristiyano. Pero actually, ang mas litaw na litaw doon sa mga millenarian movements ay actually yung elemento ng anituismo. So halimbawa, sino pa yung mga nagiging anito nila o sino yung mga nagiging nakikita nila ng mga santo. Yung mga santo nila halimbawa si Rizal, mga santo nila halimbawa mga bayani. Now, of course, yan 19 na taon. Yung simbolo, halimbawa, ng sari manok o yung tigmamanukin. By the 19th century, around December, early 1897, December 30, pinatay si Rizal, binaril si Rizal. Pero early 1897, kalat na yung balita na hindi naman talaga siya namatay. Ibig sabihin, mas, at pati si Burgos, no? Ibig sabihin, mas malinaw na yung mga elementong Kristiyano ay actually ginagamit, pero nandoon lang sa level ng mga simbolismo at wala doon talaga sa level na mayroong ideological o sa level ng ideya. No? Kasi yung pakahulugan doon sa mga yon ay actually nagmumula sa sinauna o kaisipang mga tawag dito, kaisipang nagmula pa sa sinaunang pananampalataya. Yun, I think yun yung aking masasabi doon sa inyong katanungan. Maraming salamat.
I'm not quite sure about the delay, but the archdiocese, there were only 4 that were erected as dioceses, which after the Provincial Synod of Manila in 1907. Mhm. Yeah. I will try. Doon sa devotion tungkol kay Maria, ang I think on the Aglipayan side ay magandang pag-aralan mo yan. That could be a part of your study na pwede ba itong maisali sa debosyong Katoliko, ang inyong debosyon kay Maria. That's one. But if it is a devotion to Mary, as Mary, without the title, I think there's no problem. If you have a devotion to the Blessed Virgin, without the title. Because if there's a title, then you have some problems, like Our Lady of Mary Mediatrix. It has some implications. Now, I do not know much of the story of what you're saying, but I think it would be nice if you do a research on that. Concerning the 3, why are they not technical term canonized by the Catholic Church? The thing here is you have to go through a process called the process of canonization, and it goes through different stages. So far, nobody has started the process yet. Nobody has looked into their theological virtues, whether they can serve as models for Catholics. Catholic Church canonizes, these become models. And so that is why they have to go through a kind of a process and a procedure. And somebody has to start the process. So wala pa akong nagumpisa ng proseso para sa kanilang kanonisasyon.
Opo. Sagot na po yun. Sagot na po yun.
Ako na lang muna. Kasi ay sa totoo lang, Mr. John Ray Paring, ay kinikilabutan ako sa tanong mo na o sa sinasabi mo, sa ginagamit mo salita na cult, no? Kasi tawag dito, well, ako kasi, ang tingin ko sa lahat ng yan, isang kultura lang o isang kultura. At whether yan ay tinanggap na sa isang paraan na sinasabi ng isang nag-i-impose na lehitimo tulad halimbawa ng simbahang Katoliko o kaya ay ng simbahang Protestante na ito dapat nating isipin. Yung mga tao ay mayroong pamamaraan ng kanilang pag-aangkin na maaaring yan ay malayo doon sa sinasabi, no, ng mga lehitimo. No? Kaya kung ikaw ay tinatawag mo na kulto, hindi ko alam, baka meron kang alam na lehitimo. Pero para sa akin kasi, yung mga lahat ng ito, lahat ng pananampalataya na ito ay actually lehitimo. So, tawagin mo mayang kulto, lehitimo pa rin sa akin yan. No? Kaya, sa totoo lang, kinikilabutan ako doon sa sinasabi mo na po. No? Iyan kasi pang designate doon sa mga tao na iba sa iyo. So, kung iniiba mo na yung mga tao na nakaharap sa iyo na naniniwala sa isang pamamaraan ng kanilang pagpapahayag, ng kanilang pagsamba o paniniwala, ay tawag dito, biktima ka rin ng kolonyalismo. Di man sabihin kolonyalismo or imperialismo. Biktima ka noon. Okay? So, kaya nating lahat. Siguro. So, yan lang po. Maraming salamat sa pagkakataon.
Makatagdag lang po kay Sir Omel. Yung mga latter part ng 19th century hanggang early part ng 20th century, ang dami talagang mga naglabasan ng mga religious movements na sa pananaw ng simbahan Katoliko at ng pamahalaang kolonyal na Amerikano ay mga kulto, mga panatiko, no, yung mga word na colorum, ganyan, no, na brand sila negatively. No, pero gaya nga ng pag-aaral ni Dr. Ileto, di ba, doon sa Passion and Revolution, ang daming nagdagsaan talaga. Hindi lang po ito sa Luzon, pati sa Visayas and Mindanao. Nabanggit ko na po kanina yung entrencherado, no, 1927, may mga kolorum sa Tayog, Pangasinan, no, and then even before that, no, meron din akong pag-aaral na meron din Pulahanes movement na nagpa-convert sila sa Baptist faith kasi naniniwala sila sa isang pare, si Father Juan, na isang Bicolano na na-assign bilang missionary ng Catholic Church sa Panay. Pero later on, parang napaka-sacred na ng tingin nila kay Father John, kay Padre Juan, na parang binigyan na siya ng title ng mga busalian at mga dalagangan. Parang yung mga indigenous terms na extraordinary person na ito. Maayong laki, no? Parang mataas na antas ng isang babaylan, gano'n. Kasi parang ano siya, yung kanyang buhay ay parang si Kristo. Parang ang template niya ay si Kristo na banal na tao, di ba? Parang nagpapagaling, nagmimilagro, hindi kumakain ng karne, yung mga ganun ba? So, grabe ang tingin sa kanya ng mga Pulahanes to the point na itong si Padre Juan, bago siya tinuring na erehe at ikinulong at ipinatapon ng mga Espanyol, nag-prophesy siya na darating ang panahon, mayroong mga puting tao na may banal na aklat na darating, lumapit kayo sa kanila. This was 1870, dumating ang mga si Lund at si Manikan, 1900. Kaya mayroong mga Pulahanes, mga 9,000 sila, may petition sila na ready sila mag-convert kasi because of the prophecy of Padre Juan. Pero siyempre, yun po ay example na ng parang tinatawag natin siguro na parang folk Catholic, naghalo na or folk Christian, no? Na hindi na talaga mainstream Catholic. No? Pero yung sinasabi nga ni Sir Omer kanina, isa rin itong mga anyo o yan, lahat ay anyo ng mga relihiyon. Huwag natin tatawagin kulto. Masakit. Masakit ang kulto. No word. Salamat po.
Maraming salamat po. May idadagdag po ba si Father Mike?
May mga grupo sa, kung gusto mo makano dyan, ay sa nasa Banahaw. Meron sila doon. Kung gusto maka-experience. I was there, no? So I had an experience with some of the groups doon sa Mount Banahaw. And okay, may mga Rizalista, may mga sayan. So kung gusto mo maka-express, lalo sa Holy Week, doon sa Mount Banahaw.
Okay po. Thank you. Maraming salamat po sa ating speakers today. Pati po sa mga nag-attend at nagbigay po ng mga tanong. Unfortunately, we're out of time. It's 12:18 na kasi. So what we're gonna do is tie up our panel for today. So once again, really sorry. Ang dami pong mga tanong dito sa chat natin actually, and a lot of really interesting comments. So thank you anyway for sending those. So just to quickly summarize today's session for us, I think it was very interesting to see how each speaker kind of presented either an alternative spirituality or interpretation to what had been considered the mainstream Philippine religion coming out of our out of the Philippine Revolutionary era and out of the Spanish colonial era. So many of our speakers characterized post-Spanish development of different Filipino religiosities, whether that was the Catholic tradition or the American evangelical tradition that was later Filipinized, or others as well. So what we're doing now is summarizing it so we can pull together some of those thoughts right before we end our session today. Now, in the first presentation, Dr. Hernandez described the intersections of local and Spanish discourses on the concept of the Philippine colonial subject through his lecture, Ang Diskursong Kristiyano-Espanyol at ang Pagbuo ng Nakataang Pilipino. In the second lecture, Dr. De La Cruz discussed the Filipinized version of spiritualism and occultism through the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas, as one that traces its roots not necessarily to local folk religions, but more to a localized Western movement, which she presented as an alternative interpretation of how we look at Philippine folk religions. This presentation was called Other Christianities, the Unión Espiritista Cristiana de Filipinas in the early 20th century. Now, in the third lecture by Father Mike Layugan, the third wave of the evangelization of the Philippines, we were introduced to the phases of Catholic evangelization and challenges in the Philippines. And finally, in the last lecture, Dr. Esquero characterized how the Protestant tradition in the Philippines transformed from its early introduction under the American period to its increasing independence in the 20th century, with the localization and Filipinization of that tradition, as well as the parang intersecting problems of imperialism that kind of complicated the schisms here. All in all, today's panel has very richly illustrated the varying traditions and notions of Filipino religiosity. Whatever strand that may be, what I've personally learned today is how Filipinization or localization is a powerful force in redefining what it means for there to be a tradition introduced from outside. No? And yung nakikita po nating markers of Filipino culture that emerge not only in the belief systems, but also in the process of how those belief systems are established here, are all very fine nuances for us to understand the present mosaic of Philippine religiosity. And with that, we end the panel, or this panel, and session 10 of the Philippine International Quincentennial Conference. It is now 12:21 at Philippine Standard Time. We invite everyone to catch the next session of the PIQC. So the next session, which is going to be held from December 6 to 10, is called The Early Philippine and Southeast Asian Building and Gold Crafting Technology. So ito po ay i-convene ng Father Saturnino Rios University, and you can catch it on the NQC or National Quincentennial Committee Facebook page. Now, for this particular session, you might have noticed that we were live on almost 100 Facebook pages. A really good job to the Secretariat here. Primarily the National Quincentennial Committee, the Department of Foreign Affairs, and other foreign service posts. Meaning, in the future, if you want to catch the live sessions, you could look at these pages then in the future and share them. So thank you so much for being a part of our event today. You can catch future live streams on Facebook, but you can also sign in for the Zoom sessions to be able to post your questions and to interact more directly with the speakers. Yung registration links po natin ay makahanap sa website ng NQC, which you can look up online. So that's the National Quincentennial Committee, or nqc.gov.ph/PIQC. Okay, so thank you so much for staying for extra time today. This has been your moderator, Jiraya Gray, from the University of the Philippines, Baguio. Thank you once again to our really great speakers here today and for putting up with my difficulties in speaking Filipino. It was so good to meet you all, and I hope we are able to meet you again soon. So that's it. We end the session. Have a great day, everyone, and mag-ingat po tayong lahat. Bye!
Thank you.